Chapter 762. The ginkgo leaves fell all over the ground, just like those words. The two stood on the bridge, and were silent for a while. Ninkei said, "You are eldest brother's sworn sister and my friend. The master of calligrapher asked you to leave Mogan Mountain, because he knows that helping the Tang Empire is helping the big river. No matter what, you have to work hard." Mo Shanshan was a little confused and asked, "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to have a good sleep." Ninkei said, "I am not eldest brother or second brother. I will die if I don't sleep. I want to vomit after looking at this city for 2 days. I need to relax." Mo Shanshan said, "Then go rest. But please don't feel frustrated and run away. Think about why you sat by the lake for half a day, when Monk Guanhai challenged you." Ninkei recalled the past and smiled. Next, he drew a very detailed map for Mo Shanshan, and explained the god-stunning array. Then he irresponsibly left her, and walked to Spring Breeze Pavilion in the eastern city. He did not really go to sleep, nor did he go to Yinming Lake in a daze. The court had just calmed down, and Liu was still under house arrest in the princess mansion. Many ministers were still against Ninkei, and even strongly disliked him, so he could not be too close to the palace. Now he needed to know the arrangements of the court, and communicate with the empress through the Chow Mansion in Spring Breeze Pavilion. In the Chow Mansion, he received the latest military orders and military intelligence from various states. Looking at the military intelligence briefs, his expression became serious. The Southern Battlefront Army was still on the way. The Western Army and the Yueluan Kingdom in the Pamir Mountains had not reported back yet. The Northern Battlefront Army, shouldering the most difficult task, was struggling under the attack of the cavalry of the Golden Palace. Even though the Northern Battlefront Army's numbers were reduced, it was not easy to reverse the situation. Now the most troublesome situation was the war in the east and south, especially in the south. The West Hill Divine Palace led hundreds of thousands of troops north from Qinghe Prefecture. Sitting in Chang'an, Ninkei seemed to be able to see the scene of flags waving all over the sky. He could not imagine what he would do if they attacked Chang'an. His senior brothers and sisters in the back mountain should be in the verdant canyon now. Were they all right? Would they be able to hold on? How many days could they hold on? At this moment, the prefectural magistrate of Chang, and Shengguan Yangyu and Qi For came to the Chow Mansion. Ninkei wanted to see them. "The chaos in Chang and has been quelled so quickly. Your Excellency, you have done a great job." Ninkei looked at the wretched prefectural magistrate and said sincerely. Old Master Chow passed by the door with a cat in his arms. Hearing this, he looked at Shengguan Yangyu, who was bending down, and said, "This lord likes to be humble." Ninkei said with a smile, "You're right." He waved at Old Master Chow, rubbed the cat's belly, and left. Shengguan Yangyu said charmingly, "Not at all. It's all thanks to Her Majesty and Mr. 13th's good command." Ninkei said, "At that time, the Empress and I were still outside the city. How could we command you?" Shengguan Yangyu said seriously, "When the person is gone, the righteousness lives on. I can feel it." Ninkei waved his hand and said, "Forget it. I'm not a grand secretary, and I'm not used to hearing such words. There are few officials in the Tang officialdom who would speak like you. Let's save some time and get straight to the point." Shengguan Yangyu cleared his throat and said directly, "He Mingqi should have escaped from the Dongyang Gate. The City Gate Department is investigating internally and has arrested more than a dozen suspects. The Imperial Center Administration and the Southern Gate Temple have become much more well-behaved. Those who escaped from the Qinghe County Club have all been arrested and are now temporarily detained in the club." Ninkei was very clear that the reason why the Imperial Center Administration and the Southern Gate Temple had become well-behaved had nothing to do with the exposure of He Mingqi's true identity. It was because the parents and relatives of those cultivators were now under house arrest by the Chang and local government and the Fish Dragon Gang. Under such circumstances, except for those who were truly cold-blooded, who would dare to make a move? The disciples of the Qinghe County families cannot escape the crime of treason. Although they have not been tried, why should they stay in the club and sleep comfortably? Send them all to the local government prison, Ning Ke said. Shangguan Yangyu seemed to be a little embarrassed and said, the local government can't lock so many people. Ning Ke looked at Chi For and said, the fish dragon gang must have many dungeons. Mr. Chi shrugged and said, it's not a problem to lock up a few hundred people. Ning Ke looked at the expression on Shangguan Yangyu's face and said, what's the problem? I don't have any problem, but there are many officials in the imperial court. Maybe there will be problems. Shangguan Yangyu said, there are two opinions in the imperial court about how to deal with the families of Qinghe County. One is to try them as soon as possible to give an explanation to the imperial court and the people. The other is to let the disciples of the families stay in Chang'an City alive, so that they can be used as a bargaining chip when negotiating with the West Hill Divine Palace in the future. Ning Ke was silent for a moment and said, these people must die. Shangguan Yangyu said worriedly, what if the officials in the imperial court object? Even if we want to negotiate in the future, there are some problems that cannot be discussed. Ning Ke said, the problem of Qinghe County is a problem that cannot be discussed. Of course, it is indeed a pity for these people to die now, so let them suffer first. Chi For said, I am better at this. Shangguan Yangyu said, the prefectural government is more professional. Ning Ke said, you can discuss these small things yourself. I called you here today because the Empress has decided to hand over the City Gate Department and the temporary law enforcement power to His Excellency. The Fish Dragon Gang will also temporarily be under His Excellency's command. Mr. Chi, you have to cooperate with His Excellency and do this well. Shangguan Yangyu was very clear that as long as he could survive this war, he would definitely be promoted after the war. However, he did not expect that he would suddenly have such a great power. He could not help but feel a little excited and a little scared. Mr. Chi also felt a little strange. This arrangement was a little strange. Chang'an City is very empty. If the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army, no matter which side the enemy is from, there is nothing we can do if they come to the city. So you have to be prepared in advance after the city is breached. Hearing Ning Ke's words, Shangguan Yangyu and Mr. Chi were shocked and speechless. Just like all the Tangs, they had never thought that Chang'an City would be breached one day. Don't spread this news. Ning Ke did not look at Chi For, but looked at Shangguan Yangyu's eyes. That pair of wretched triangular eyes flashed with a complicated look. Ning Ke looked at him and said calmly, if something goes wrong, there will be no Shangguan in the world. He said he wanted to rest, but how could he rest? How could he sleep with such a heavy stone in his heart? Ning Ke walked along the Vermilion Bird Avenue to the south gate. He felt the subtle changes in the aura of heaven and earth, and observed the blocked areas along the way. He looked more and more tired, and his footsteps became heavier. When he came to the city wall, he looked at the top of the city wall. The city wall of Chang'an was as high as a cliff. Standing on the ground, it was difficult to see the picture at the top. His eyesight was far sharper than that of ordinary people, so he could see the girl in the white cotton dress. She was looking at Chang'an City and thinking hard. Just like him before, Ning Ke thanked her silently. She can recognize the stone array tactics. This girl is indeed more talented than you in tactical arrays. But since the teacher has handed Chang'an City to you, I think you need to figure it out yourself. A little girl walked to his side and looked up at the city wall. The little girl was about 12 or 13 years old. Her black ponytails swayed at her waist. She looked young and cute, but her tone was calm, gentle and mature. It was not inappropriate to call Emo Shanshan a little girl. She was the current leader of the Devil's Doctrine, so she was qualified to call the calligraphy addict a little girl. Senior sister, I really can't think of any way. Ning Ke said. Yu Lian looked at him and said, so you have already started to plan to break the city. Ning Ke said, I don't think about winning but about losing first. This is my habit. Yu Lian said, if it is a normal time, this is not a problem. But the situation now is that the Tang Empire will lose, So we must only think about winning, not about losing. Ning Ke did not understand. Yu Lian said, we can only think about how to win, but not how to face failure. But if failure is destined, how can we win? Then we have to win before we lose. Yu Lian said, the final result of a war depends on many aspects. Maybe second brother can't defend the verdant canyon. Maybe the northern battlefront army will be defeated by the Golden Tribe. Maybe Chang and will be broken. But as long as we can win in one aspect before these failures come, we can prevent these failures from happening. Ning Ke understood and said, the most important thing is to win. Yes, Yu Lian said. In your opinion, what will be the outcome of this war? Ning Ke was very clear that the Tang Empire had suffered a series of setbacks at the beginning of the war. The gap between the two sides had widened. Even if the verdant canyon could be defended and the god-stunning array could be repaired, it would still be difficult to change the final outcome. We will probably still lose, he said. But I believe that when the Tang Empire is destroyed, there will not be many countries left in the world. Yes, this is the truth that everyone in the world can understand. The royal families and the generals of the various countries are stupid, but they should be able to understand this. Yu Lian said, the Tang Empire and the Academy have begun to show their power. People are dying everywhere. I believe the Yueluan Kingdom is in a miserable state in Chaoyang City. The Yin Kingdom has also crippled itself. Who would want to die with the Tang Empire? Ning Ke said, I heard that the Emperor of the South Jin Kingdom is a little crazy because of the death of his son. Yu Lian said, if the Emperor wants to drag the entire South Jin Kingdom into the swamp of madness, the royal family and the generals will come out to stop him. Because there are more people who are not crazy. Only the West Hill Divine Palace wants to destroy the Tang Empire at all costs. She continued, Xiong Chimo has been crippled. The Divine Hall of Revelation and the Hall of Judgment will be seriously injured, or even killed after the Battle of the Verdant Canyon. What else does the Divine Hall have? Ning Ke was deep in thought. A few days ago, eldest brother and I have been thinking about a problem. How to win in a certain defeat, at least a temporary victory, and a temporary peace. Until we figured it out. Yu Lian looked at him and said, kill the Abbey Dean and this war will end. Ning Ke did not know what to say. This inference was correct. If the Abbey Dean of the Jishou Abbey was killed by the Academy, the West Hill Divine Palace would suffer a great loss, and its influence on the countries in the secular world would be weakened. Then, which country would be willing to be destroyed with the Tang Empire? More importantly, if the Abbey Dean died, Taoism would no longer have any restraints on the sword Garrett and Liu Bai. However, the problem was, the Abbey Dean was the most powerful and unfathomable powerhouse in the world, after the headmaster of the Academy ascended to heaven. The difficulty of killing him was not much different from the Tang Empire winning this tragic war. Ning Ke looked at her and said, Senior sister, did you stay in Chang'an and not go to the Verdant Canyon because of this? Yu Lian said, I am not confident that I can defeat him. The Abbey Dean is more powerful than you and most people in the world can imagine. He is even more powerful than we can imagine. Ning Ke knew that eldest brother was competing with the Abbey Dean in the distanceless state. In his impression, the Abbey Dean was not worthy of his senior sister's description, no matter how powerful he was. Yu Lian said, you will know when the Abbey Dean makes his move. Ning Ke said, what can I do? Yu Lian said, repair the city. Ning Ke finally completely understood what eldest brother and third sister meant. If Chang'an was destroyed, it would be a failure. If the Academy could kill the Abbey Dean of the Jishou Abbey before Chang'an was destroyed, it would be a victory. When eldest brother brought the Abbey Dean to Chang'an, he needed to repair at least a part of the city, the part where he killed people. If he could not do that, he would not need to repair the city anymore. This was the last light of night before dawn. It could also be the last step before the abyss. Ning Ke felt more and more stressed, so much so that he had difficulty breathing. At night, Emo Shanshan stood by the city wall. Her cheeks were slightly red from the cold autumn wind. She crossed her arms and looked at the lights in front of her. Suddenly she understood something. But the divine light disappeared immediately. She did not know where it went. She frowned slightly and continued to look at the city. Ning Ke was also looking at the city. He sat on Yanming Mountain and looked across the lake. The scene across the lake was a fragment of Chang'an City. His and Song Song's house was also there. No one lived there for a long time. It was dark and cold. He looked at it for a long time and remembered many things. When he received the challenge from Monk Guanhai, he pondered for a long time by the lake and learned a lot. Of course, most of the past was related to Sang Sang, but he did not feel anything. He was very tired. He fell into a deep sleep in the cold night. When he woke up, there were still no lights across the lake. Because it was dawn, the sound of peddlers came from the morning fog. After the morning fog dispersed, the residential streets were occupied by the steam from the bun shops. People gradually came to life. It turned out that the other side was not so cold. Ning Ke looked in that direction and vaguely captured something. Have a good weekend. See you tomorrow. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 763. Ning Ke got up, brushed off the grass and dew on his body, and walked to the other side of the lake. There was a patch of white autumn reeds on the east side of the lake, and a wooden bridge was hidden in the reeds. He walked across the bridge, through the side door and alley of his house, and came to the noisy morning market. In the mortal world, the emperor was dead, but the people were still alive. The war continued and so did life. The steam from the bun shop spread like fog on the street, and the soup from the noodle shop drenched the bluestone road. The people queued up to buy breakfast, and talked about the news in the neighborhood as usual. Of course, the topics included the war at the border, and some women were worried about their nephews in the army. Ning Ke walked to the bun shop, listening to the sound of boiling water in the steamer, looking at the steam in front of him, listening to the simple but simple words, and watching the cute action of the children tearing the paper of the bun. He suddenly felt something. It was in front of this bun shop that he met Daosher Monk, and saw a bun in the wilderness. It was a 1,000-year-old grave, and it was the most dangerous battle since he entered the human realm. At that time, the morning wind gradually blew, and Daosher Monk's head rolled down, like a hot bun that was not held by the children because it was too hot. Then the bluestone road was soaked with blood, thicker than dew, and more fishy than noodle soup. Time passed silently, and the bloodstains from that year could no longer be seen on the bluestone street. The traces of the battle from that year could no longer be seen, and people could not even remember what had happened that morning. The morning market was still the morning market. The bun shop was still the bun shop, and the boss and the cook were still the same. But the children who bought the bun were no longer the children. Was this the power of time? Ning Ke stood in front of the bun shop, silently recalling the scene of the past, and then remembered what happened after Sang Sang placed the black chess piece on the Buddhist chessboard in the cave on Hua Mountain. In the world of Haotian, the highest rules were eternal, such as time and death. Other than that, what other rules could reach that level? The morning light became fuzzy because of the refraction of the steam, as if there were countless fragments of time in it. The street was crowded. Ning Ke stood in the street, closed his eyes, and lowered his head, feeling everything around him. He saw many scenes. The old bloodstains were washed away with clean water, leaving behind some remnants. Then, countless people queuing up to buy the buns stepped on them, and took them away from the original ground, leaving no trace on the bluestone. The child held the steaming hot meat buns, and walked on the bluestone slabs. The woman used a bamboo basket to catch the steaming buns. She scolded her husband for staying in bed while walking on the bluestone. The woman gradually grew old, and the child from back then had grown up, married, and had children. The old woman was waiting at home, and the children began to line up with their mothers to buy buns. Before they got home, they secretly took one and held it in their hands. Over the years, countless pairs of feet had walked on these bluestone slabs, and the bluestone slab's surface had become extremely smooth. He saw a wasteland full of weeds, a farmer lighting a fire in the middle of the grassland, an old ox taking heavy steps in the field, and black soil being turned over. Rice and wheat began to be planted in the fields, and in autumn, the golden grains grew. The farmers began to harvest the grains. The stone mill slowly turned, grinding out fine white flour, which was then sent to the city to be made into steamed buns or buns. He also saw a lot of images, and thus understood some things. When people walked in the world, they would inevitably leave behind traces. However, as people continued to walk, these traces would disappear without a trace when no one noticed them. This was not the power of time, but the power of man himself. He opened his eyes and looked at the endless flow of people in the morning market, and a smile appeared on his face. This city was very large, and this tactical array was very great. Therefore, after the teacher who represented the entire human world left, no one could be found who could mobilize enough chi of heaven and earth to repair this city and this tactical array. But the human world was still there. That power was still in the human world. Ning-Ke did not know what the aura hidden in the human world was. It was not accurate to describe it as power. He could feel the power, and even faintly touched the supreme rules. But he did not know how to describe this feeling. What words should he use to describe it? The taste of life or the smell of smoke and fire? He did not know how to mobilize that aura, but at least he had a clue. Most importantly, for the first time, he truly felt that aura. At that moment, he was connected with the teacher and many predecessors. Therefore, he was in a good mood. He saw Imo Shanshan at the other end of the street. Imo Shanshan looked at Chang'an from the city wall. She did not sleep all night, so she looked very tired. Ning-Ke walked to the bun shop, bought 2 hot buns, and then walked to the other end of the street. Beef and radish stuffing, a big bun for 2 coins. He handed the bun to Imo Shanshan. Imo Shanshan took the bun with both hands. Her hands were a little small, and the cotton dress was a little loose. The cuffs covered half of her palms. The bun was very big, and she had to hold it with both hands. She carefully tore off the paper stuck to the bun skin, and then carefully took a bite. She looked very focused and cute. He came to the south gate. He climbed the city wall and looked at Chang'an in the autumn wind. Have you ever had the experience of staring at a word for a long time and feeling that the word is getting stranger and stranger? Whether it is the structure or the appearance, it always feels like it is not a word. Of course, I used to think that it was because I got used to understanding the 8 strokes calligraphy of Yong. Ning-Ke looked at the city under the city wall bathed in the morning light, and then continued. But these 2 days, after looking at Chang'an for a long time, I found that this is a very natural thing. Imo Shanshan said. I only looked at it for a night, but Chang'an is no longer a city in my eyes. Is it a talisman or an array? Neither. I think this city is a person. Imo Shanshan looked at the roads and buildings in the city, and said, this person is called Chang'an. His snow mountain and ocean of chi acupoints are blocked, and he is waiting for us to help him open up all his acupoints. Ning-Ke was silent for a moment, and then said, this is very interesting, very similar to me in the past. But because of this, I know that it is basically impossible to open up an ordinary person's chi acupoint. But your acupoints are finally open. Imo Shanshan looked at him and said, so I plan to use your method to cure Chang'an. Ning-Ke remembered those past events. But in fact, until now he was not very clear why his snow mountain and ocean of chi suddenly opened up, and why he could cultivate. Imo Shanshan looked at the sky and said, Chang'an's snow mountain and ocean of chi are the heaven and earth. We cannot command the heaven and earth, so we can only let the heaven and earth do it themselves. There are a few reasons why I can't write today. The first is that Lin Hai Tingtao released a new book, and I went to be the guest host. My mind isn't clear. The second reason was that the contents of this chapter were too taxing on the brain. This chapter talked about the most fundamental things of Nightfall. Most importantly, in the following scenes, second senior brother would start to stir up trouble. The previous scenes were all small ones, and the next one would be a big one. The problem was, how should I do it? I wasn't confident yet, so I didn't dare to continue. At this moment, I grabbed my hair and thought about it. Today is Saturday, and it's the day to make up for it. Today I owe everyone 4,000. I will definitely make up for it within 10 days and 2 shifts. I will explain to everyone that it's all Lin Hai and second senior brother's fault. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 764. There was a blockage in a hidden line in the God-stunning array, so the exit of the hidden line was completely blocked. According to the principle of life and death in the tactical array, the flow of the aura of heaven and earth from the north to the south was forced to stop completely, so that the aura of heaven and earth in the city became more and more stagnant, until it backflowed and broke the blockage with the help of heaven and earth itself. The prescription that Mo Shanshan gave to Chang was very simple, but extremely violent. It was hard to imagine that it was made by such a beautiful and gentle girl. If she treated a real person, he would definitely bleed to death after taking the medicine. But if it was Chang who took the medicine, would it be different? Ning Ke was silent for a long time and asked, "Where to block it? How?" The exit of this line is the south gate, which happens to be the living gate of the God-stunning array. It faces the Vermilion Bird Avenue. If we want to block it, we naturally have to seal this gate. As for the method, Mo Shanshan said, I want to block this gate with stones. Using stones to block the gate sounded fine, but Ning Ke knew that the physical blockage was meaningless to the flow of the aura of heaven and earth in Chang'an. So he immediately understood what she meant. He thought of the countless stones at the bottom of the Daming Lake outside the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine, and the tactical array named Stone Array Tactics. Are you confident? He asked. Mo Shanshan shook her head and said, No, but I can't think of any other way. You told me that the last way is the best way, so I want to try. This was indeed what Ning Ke often said. He thought for a while and said, Although it is a little risky, it seems to be a little interesting. Time was pressing. The project of sealing the south gate of Vermilion Bird had to be carried out immediately. Ning Ke asked the Azure Dragon gang under the gate to inform Spring Breeze Pavilion, and then informed the palace of this arrangement. The administrative ability of the Imperial Court of the Tang Empire was perfectly demonstrated in the next few hours. It didn't take long for several tactical array masters and more than 3,000 temporary conscripted workers, led by the Ministry of Works and the Imperial Center Administration, to arrive at the South Gate. They were all under the command of Mo Shanshan. Mo Shanshan asked, As for the more than 30,000 stones, where can we find so many stones? Ning Ke looked at the houses in the city and said, If it doesn't work, we'll tear them down. The assistant minister of the Ministry of Revenue, who had come under the edict, was silent for a moment. He then said in a small voice, There is a lake 3 li south of the city. There are many stones in the lake. In the past, when the manors of the princes and dukes built their manors. Without waiting for him to finish his words, Ning Ke said, Since there are lake stones, that would be the best. If you have any ideas, why don't you tell Miss Mo directly? Now is not the time for pleasantries. The assistant minister of the Ministry of Revenue agreed. Mo Shanshan asked again, I need a few hundred heavy rocks that weigh more than 10,000 kilograms. Can you move them? The assistant minister of Revenue said, The equipment in the Ministry of Works storeroom is being transported here. Not to mention 10,000 caddies. Even 100,000 caddies of heavy stone can be taken out of the lake and transported to the South Gate. The Imperial Court decreed that the South Gate of Chang would be closed from then on. The grain teams and people would enter and leave through the other gates. Thousands of people, technical officials from the Ministry of Revenue, and array tactical masters volunteered to come. Under Emo Shanshan's command, they began to set up tactical arrays and move giant stones. The south gate suddenly became a big construction site, and it was extremely lively. After confirming that there were no other problems, Ning Ke bid farewell to Emo Shanshan. Emo Shanshan asked in surprise, "What are you going to do?" Ning Ke said, "The last way is the best way. But it is not the last moment yet. I want to see if I can find another way." Emo Shanshan did not say anything more. She said calmly, "I wish you good luck." Ning Ke bowed and turned to leave. To enter Chang'an from the south gate, one had to pass through the famous Vermilion Bird Avenue. The late autumn sky was sometimes high and sometimes gloomy. It all depended on whether there were any clouds covering the sky. When Ning Ke walked along the Vermilion Bird Avenue to the north, a cloud floated in from outside the city and blocked the sunlight from the sky. It cast a large shadow and lowered the temperature in the city. The stone statues on the Vermilion Bird Avenue also appeared much darker because of the change in the light. The autumn wind blew, and there were raindrops falling. The cold autumn rain chased the pedestrians on the street to the side. Ning Ke did not leave. He still stood where he was. He reached behind him and wanted to take out the big black umbrella, but he only touched the hilt of his knife. Then he remembered that the big black umbrella was no longer with him. The big black horse and the horse carriage were also not with him. Sang Sang was also not with him. Ning Ke thought of the feeling when he and Sang Sang saw it for the first time. He thought of the old days when he was covered in blood and fell in front of it. He was silent and had very complicated feelings. When the headmaster of the academy took him and Sang Sang to the human world for the last time, they had returned to Chang'an. At that time, the vermilion bird appeared in the black horse carriage. The vermilion bird was a divine talisman in the God-stunning array. Ning Ke was the owner of the God-stunning array. Moreover, they were teacher. So at this time, although they did not speak, they seemed to have a telepathic connection. They looked at each other without words. Only emotions and thoughts echoed between him and the vermilion bird. You are only at the peak of the knowing destiny state. Ning Ke looked at the vermilion bird painting that looked more and more lively after being wet by the rain. He thought silently in his heart, what's the use for a powerhouse like the Abbey Dean? Young Erxie took back the pitchfork, panting, and stood in the field to rest with it. There was a grave in front of him. The soil on it was very fresh and had just been piled up. The pig trotters on the pitchfork had been given to the refugees. Recently, he began to fight with the grassland barbarian's machete. But the pitchfork in his hand was getting sharper and sharper, because he used it more often. The pitchfork was much better for digging up soil than the machete. These days he dug many graves and buried the bodies of many of his companions. When he had enough rest, young Erxie spat and shouted to his companions not far away. Then he put the pitchfork on his shoulder and walked wearily to the forest in the west. In this wilderness, more than 2,000 new graves were built. They were very small and simple graves. The Tang army would never leave any of its companions, whether alive or dead. Even if they could not do it during the war, they would try their best to find the bodies of their companions after the war. But this was originally the territory of the Tang Empire. The soldiers were buried here, which meant that they were buried in their hometown. It was said that when His Majesty returned to Chang'an, there was only a box of ashes. These dead soldiers had nothing to complain about. Not long after the war began, Cao Xiaoshu led the valiant cavalry battalion out of Chang, and then went straight to the eastern border to fight with the grassland cavalry. In the following days, there were constantly voluntary retired soldiers joining them. At the same time, there were also the northeast border military soldiers, who had withdrawn from the Yin territory. The number of soldiers was increasing. Now the army had more than 30,000 people, and was officially named the Volunteer Army by the imperial court. But because of the lack of equipment, especially war horses, they were still at a disadvantage compared to the grassland cavalry. Just yesterday, the Volunteer Army of the eastern border and the grassland cavalry had a real battle. The disadvantaged Volunteer Army won the final victory with unimaginable courage. For this, on this eastern border field, thousands of volunteer army paid the price with their lives. However, what made Qiao Xiaoshu and the generals of the valiant cavalry battalion vigilant was that no one had ever found Prince Longqing and those fallen commanders in this fierce battle. What made them even more uneasy was that the most powerful papal cavalrymen of the Divine Hall and the grassland elites were nowhere to be found. Qiao Xiaoshu looked at the forest in the west and thought of the urgent military report sent by Pingyuan County. His face seemed to be covered with a layer of frost. He said, "They have gone to Chang'an." The volunteer army of the eastern border had fought continuously and had difficulties in providing logistical support. They were already extremely exhausted. To be able to defeat most of the grassland cavalry in the battle yesterday was already an extraordinary performance. At this time, even if they knew that Prince Longqing was heading straight for Chang, and with a group of elites, they had no ability to respond, let alone intercept them in front of them. Lu Vi listened to Qiao Xiaoshu's judgment, and his expression became extremely solemn. But he was still somewhat puzzled. He said, "Most of the barbarian cavalrymen are scattered in the eastern border. Although Longqing's subordinates are elites, it is absolutely impossible for them to attack Chang'an." This was the reason why Qiao Xiaoshu's face was as cold as frost. It was obviously meaningless. Why was Longqing willing to give up so many troops just to buy time to attack Chang'an? There was only one explanation. Longqing firmly believed that when his cavalry arrived, Chang'an would definitely fall. The verdant canyon was in front of the Green Mountains. Before the Green Mountains was a plain. Most of this flat and fertile field belonged to Qinghe Prefecture, and a small part was expropriated by the military ministry. Other than the meadows, there were many fields that had been cultivated for many years. After several days of bloody battles, the autumn grass had long been covered with blood. Tens of thousands of acres of fertile land had been trampled into mud by the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army. Too many tragedies had happened this autumn. The farmers had fled in all directions, and the rice in the fields had not been harvested. They were powerless in the wind and looked like criminals waiting to be hanged. On the right front of the verdant canyon, there was a relatively flat rice field that had not been trampled by the cavalry. The rice in the field was densely packed in golden, looking very beautiful. Yisu was in this rice field. He walked toward the verdant canyon. The wind rose with his footsteps, and the golden ears of rice were blown in all directions. Then, they bounced up like a golden ocean. Then, the ocean of rice gradually parted, opening a path for him. The sea of rice had to give way because of the thin wooden sword. After Kohaoren, Jun Emo was the proudest person in the academy. He was the legendary Mr. Second. Yisu was a Haotian Taoism genius who had seen through life and death more than 10 years ago. He was also a legendary figure. They were truly people who did not live in this world. When these two people met, who would be the stronger one? In the field in front of the Green Mountains, all eyes were on the rice field and the wooden sword. It was quiet between heaven and earth. Only the war horses neighed and kicked their hooves anxiously. For more than 2 days, the cavalrymen, who had been ready to attack at any time, got off their horses. They knew that they could not interfere in this battle. It was a battle for the dignity of the powerhouses. In the sacred sedan, Yi Hongyu looked at the verdant canyon silently, her fingers lightly touching the blood-red divine robe. Yi Su came to the verdant canyon. He looked at the iron canopy, then at the scorched black armor on second brother's body. Finally, his eyes fell on the iron sword. He frowned slightly and was about to say something. Second brother's voice sounded first. It was still as serious as ever. He looked at Yi Su and said, "You are standing in the wrong place." Yi Su did not expect to hear such a sentence. He calmed himself down and asked seriously, "What's wrong?" "That is the field, not the road." Second brother said, "The road is for walking, and the field is for growing food. There is a road, but you chose to walk from the field. That is a waste of food. Of course it is wrong." The disciples of the academy in front of the verdant canyon were a little nervous because of Yi Su's arrival. But now they could not help but laugh. They felt that it was just like how senior brother had taught them all these years. There was no nonsense, no frown, no hesitation. He just said one sentence when he saw you. Because you were wrong, he would say you were wrong. Second brother was such a person. No matter if the other party was a Haotian Taoism wayfarer or an emperor's prostitute, as long as you were wrong, you should be taught a lesson. This was second brother's rule. Everything in the world was big and small. Wasting food was wrong. Standing in the wrong place was wrong. Wearing secular clothes, but wearing a Taoist bun was also wrong. In second brother's eyes, Yi Su was full of problems, which made him very unhappy and even a little disappointed. Yi Su could feel his emotions and could not help but laugh. He thought that Junemo was indeed the legendary temperament. He smiled and said, "Your way is no longer suitable. Moreover, this is a war." Second brother said, "What is suitable for the time. Planting rice and harvesting is something that will last for 1,000 years. How can it be changed because of the situation?" Yi Su gradually stopped smiling and said, "How can you control others?" Second brother said, "The battle of the verdant canyon lasted for more than 2 days. I did not show mercy to any enemy who trampled on the field." Although those cavalrymen did not know, they knew to seek advantages and avoid disadvantages. That is why the field you are in is left. Yi Su looked around the sea of rice and became slightly serious. Last night, with the permission of the disciples of the academy, the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army collected the corpses overnight. At this time, there were not many corpses left in front of the verdant canyon, but the blood was still in the field. There should have been a large rice field next to the sea of rice where he was. At this time, the rice field had been trampled into a wasteland. The rice was scattered on the ground, and the scene was very bleak. The blood in the rice field was the deepest and most condensed, like pulp. Yi Su then knew that Junemo did not lie. As expected, all the cavalrymen who trampled on the field were killed by him. In such a fierce battle, a slight distraction would lead to the destruction of the sword and the death of the person. However, under such circumstances, second brother still did not forget to use the iron sword to enforce his rules. What kind of person was he? Yi Su stood in the rice field and was silent for a long time. He reached out to pluck an ear of rice and gently rubbed it. Looking at the soil soaked in blood under his feet, he said, "I don't want to be taught. How can you teach me?" Second brother said, "You are wrong, so I will teach you. If you don't want to be taught, I will beat you until you do." There is one more chapter. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 765. If you don't agree, I'll beat you until you do. Actually, this was not second brother's rule, but the rule of the academy. It sounded a little overbearing and unreasonable, but in fact, it was reasonable. Yi Su was not angry. He said calmly, "Reason has nothing to do with force. Junemo, even if you can defeat me, you can't make me agree with you. The truth comes from Haotian, and reason comes from the evaluation of reality and from the teachings of sages. Mr. First can teach me, but you can't." Since it didn't make sense, there was no need to say anything more. For people at Junemo and Yi Su's level, their conversation was just a casual chat, or it could be said that it was limited to the words themselves. One stood in front of the verdant canyon, and the other in the rice field. The hundreds of thousands of people watching the battle in the field looked nervously in the direction of the verdant canyon. They did not know how the battle would start, when they would attack, or who would attack first. At some point in time, Yi Su made his move. The attack of the genius of Haotian Taoism against the genius of the academy was different from what everyone had imagined. There was no earth-shattering, no rolling rocks, and no terrible power. Instead, it seemed extremely calm. The thin wooden sword flew from Yisu to the verdant canyon. It was calm and silent. The rice field in front of the sword parted like a willow branch in the lake. Countless eyes stared at the wooden sword. Some were surprised, some were puzzled, and some were even disappointed. However, in the next moment, a shocking scene appeared in front of the verdant canyon. As the wooden sword flew, a cloud suddenly appeared in front of the verdant canyon. The cloud was dozens of feet thick and extremely dark. Thunder and lightning could be vaguely seen in it. It was very low to the ground, only more than 100 feet. Looking from a distance, it seemed to touch the ground. The exit of the verdant canyon was covered by the cloud. Between the cloud and the ground was the iron canopy and Junemo outside. The fourth brother took a few decoctions and was slightly refreshed. However, looking at the cloud in the sky and feeling the aura of heaven and earth contained in it, his arms holding the sand table trembled again. He was shocked. A cultivator who could use such a method must have a terrifying understanding of the origin and laws of the aura of heaven and earth. This is the true peak of the 5 realms. Yisu is indeed a genius of Taoism. Fourth brother looked at the wooden sword flying in the paddy field and said absent-mindedly, "Second brother uses the power of heaven and earth to cut people with his iron sword. Yisu is also using the power of heaven and earth now. Their realms are similar." Seventh sister Muyu asked worriedly, "Who is stronger?" Fourth brother said, "I don't know. Lu Bai is probably the only one who can see it." The verdant canyon was covered by white clouds. In the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army, there were many priests, cultivators, and papal cavalrymen who had participated in the war in the wilderness in spring. They had seen this cloud and seen the most powerful warrior of the desolate, Tang, being beaten up by this cloud. So when they saw this scene, they were shocked and excited. In the divine sedan, Yi Hongyu slowly raised her head and looked at the white clouds. A complicated emotion appeared in the depths of her eyes. Then, all these emotions turned into indifference on her face. When she chased after Long Qing at the frontier fortress in the north of Yin Kingdom, she had seen this cloud by the waist-deep blue sea. So the meaning of this cloud to her was different from that to the others in the West Hill Divine Palace. Lu Bai looked at the white clouds in the verdant canyon and did not speak. The clouds in the verdant canyon were white, but because they were too low to the ground and too dense, they became very gloomy and dark, just like the dark clouds that would rain in midsummer. The color of the wooden sword was light white, just like Yisu's clothes. After flying down from the dark clouds, it suddenly became very conspicuous. It looked like a slow lightning bolt. Suddenly, a bright light flashed in the dark clouds. Then countless bright lights emerged from the depths of the clouds and turned into countless bolts of lightning. They looked like countless light swords, terrifying light swords. The lightning did not last only for a moment. It pierced through the clouds and fell on the field more than 100 feet below. Then came the roar of thunder. Countless terrible muffled thunders smashed toward the verdant canyon. Second brother's armor had been scorched black by Yi Hongyu's tens of thousands of Taoist sword fireworks in the battle yesterday. At this time, it reflected the countless bright bolts of lightning that fell from the sky, like countless light snakes crawling on the black soil. He held the iron sword, his posture straight and his expression serious. The tall hat was fastened to the helmet, and it remained unmoving amidst the lightning and thunder. His eyebrows did not even tremble a bit. His expression was so dignified. The dark clouds were pressing down, and there were tens of thousands of lightning and thunder. But he seemed to be attending a banquet. He did not watch from the side, nor did he look sideways. He did not look at the clouds or the sword. He only looked at Yisu and the rice field in the distance. He raised the iron sword in his hand, leveled it, and made an ancient salute. As he held his sword horizontally, the autumn wind that was blowing toward him immediately became silent, becoming silent. The thunder and lightning finally fell. There were countless terrible roars in front of the verdant canyon. Countless bolts of lightning struck the ground almost instantaneously, carrying with them a terrifying power. The dark clouds twisted restlessly, and the lightning drilled into the green mountains like snakes, causing the rocks to collapse. Second brother leveled the sword, and the autumn wind suddenly became cold. Even the space in front of him seemed to have been drawn into countless squares by the wide and straight iron sword, and then turned into square frames, and finally into thin strips. Countless bolts of lightning fell on his body and entered those spaces. The lightning that should have been zigzagging suddenly became straight and bright lines. The lightning flashed and the thunder continued. The surface of the scorched armor reflected the lightning, and it became brighter and brighter. The soldiers of the coalition army, who were watching the battle in the southern field, felt as if they were looking at the sun. Their eyes were pierced with extreme pain, and they hurriedly covered their eyes. Those who reacted slower cried out in pain. The cultivators also closed their eyes and used their psyche power to sense the changes in the verdant canyon. They sensed the pure and majestic aura of heaven and earth contained in the lightning, and were shocked speechless by the wooden sword. Perhaps it was only a moment, but to the hundreds of thousands of people watching the battle, it felt like hundreds of millions of years had passed. The clouds in the verdant canyon finally dissipated, the thunder stopped, and the lightning naturally disappeared. The smoke and dust gradually settled, and the figure of second brother slowly appeared. He stood in front of the verdant canyon. His armor was as scorched as before, and his expression was as serious and upright as before. The iron sword was still leveled between his eyebrows, and his posture was so standard that even the strictest etiquette professor could not find any problems with it. On the ground in front of him, there were thousands of finger-thick black holes on the ground. Each black hole was a bolt of lightning drawn by Yisu's wooden sword. The black holes were bottomless, and one could imagine their power. What was shocking was that these black holes were all in front of second brother, and the ground behind him was as flat as before. Not a single one of the tens of thousands of lightning bolts landed on his body, and not a single one landed on the iron canopy behind him. Thousands of black holes were neatly arranged in front of him, and they looked like a straight line. Thunder and lightning had supreme power. It came from heaven and earth, and only submitted to the rules of nature. However, it could not cross the line in front of second brother. The etiquette of the academy was the rule. This line was the rule that second brother guarded with his iron sword. It was his etiquette. If there was a rule, it must be obeyed, no matter whose sword it was, whether it was wind, rain, or lightning. The clouds should be in the sky, in the mountains, and should not be so low. How could thunder and lightning disturb me? Today I finished 2 chapters. I was very happy. I wanted to write more to make up for yesterday's, but strangely, my cervical vertebra, which has been fine for days, suddenly became very uncomfortable. I still did not sleep on a pillow. After thinking about it, I found that there was only one possibility. I slept for 12 hours today, and I slept too much. Alas! See you tomorrow. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 766. The clouds and thunder dispersed. The wooden sword shook slightly and flew back to the sea of rice from the verdant canyon. Yisu raised his eyebrows slightly. He knew that Junemo was strong, but he didn't expect him to be so strong. Only by surpassing the threshold of the 5 states could he create his own rules in Haotian's world. Second brother did not surpass the 5 states, but he found his strongest belief in the established rules of Haotian's world, and made those rules his own. From a certain point of view, this kind of method had already surpassed the limits of Realm 5. Yisu's eyebrows gradually calmed down. He had already drawn his sword. Now it was second brother's turn. He looked at the verdant canyon and waved his arms. He put his sleeves behind his back and said calmly, "Please." Second brother drew his sword. His sword was simpler. The broad and straight iron sword left his right hand, and the verdant canyon, The iron sword was about a man's height above the ground and slowly flew toward the rice field. There was a distance between the verdant canyon and the rice field, and the land was stained with blood. It was not fresh blood, but the blood of countless cavalrymen and war horses 2 days ago. The plains were soaked in blood. It was black and gave off a pungent smell of blood, especially the field in front of the sea of rice. It was stained with blood, and the color of the soil had changed. The iron sword flew over the blood-stained field without any smell of blood. But there was a sense of death. It wasn't deathly silence, nor was it despair. It was a resolute thought. It was extremely chilling. Today, he met Yisu in front of the verdant canyon. Meeting was not an encounter, because the swords in their hands had never met. His iron sword was to meet Yisu's wooden sword. This iron sword had already killed thousands of people. The blood on the field was all caused by this iron sword. It was the iron sword's own blood. When the iron sword met his own blood, it was full of momentum and chilling to the extreme. They had just met each other with courtesy, and now they met with swords. Even Yisu would not be able to dodge such a domineering strike. He could only raise his sword to meet it. In the distant southern wilderness, Lu Bai slowly stood up beside the carriage. He looked at the iron sword in the verdant canyon and said, "This sword is finally interesting." The Battle of Verdant Canyon lasted for more than 2 days. The most powerful man in the world did not make a move, because he was waiting for Jun Mo to enter his strongest state. Otherwise, it would be meaningless. At this moment, looking at this iron sword, he finally made an interesting evaluation. This also meant that he believed that second brother had already entered his strongest state, and he really wanted to receive this sword. This iron sword was indeed interesting. It was even more interesting than what Lu Bai had imagined. The iron sword still represented second brother's rule. Black or white, no gray. Life or death. It was impossible to satisfy both. Fight or lose, there was no escape. In the face of such a decisive sword, no matter who it was, they had to make the most decisive choice and decision. You must choose a path. You must choose a direction. There was no third path in the world, and the weeds on the wall could not fall to their own positions. This iron sword had already surpassed the scope of tyranny. It faintly exuded a sense of righteousness. I'll give you a chance to choose, then I'll crush you and kill you. This was the way of the king. What would you choose between life and death? Even if you had really seen through life and death still existed. Seeing through did not mean that you could break through. Instead, because you saw too much, you would not know how to choose. If you did not choose, you would fail. This was the difficult problem that the iron sword gave Yisu. Yisu did not take this iron sword, because the iron sword represented his rule. Once he took it, it was equivalent to accepting his rule. Then no matter how the battle developed, he could not change the passive situation. But the iron sword wanted him to take it. What could he do? Yisu let the paddy field take the iron sword. This paddy field was his rule. Before the iron sword left the verdant canyon, he had already put his hands behind his back and slightly waved his sleeves. A breeze came out of his sleeves, and the golden paddy was gently shaken and sometimes bent. The wide and straight iron sword entered the paddy field. The paddy field gradually separated, like a lake, like the sea, like green pines in the green mountains. The weeds on the ridges were stained with blood. The unharvested paddy field was stained with blood. Wherever the iron sword passed, the weeds were broken into pieces, flying up and falling in the paddy field. The heavy ears of rice fell with the sword intent. Without the heavy burden, the paddy field suddenly straightened up and flicked the rice leaves into the air. The ears of rice fell to the ground. Before they hit the ground, the rice was peeled off and danced with the leaves. The bran on the paddy field cracked, revealing the round rice grains. The rice grains were scattered in the autumn wind, like pearls reflecting the sunlight. It was extremely beautiful. The rice grains scattered in the air were burnt yellow by the sunlight, emitting a rice fragrance. The rice grains that fell to the ground were soaked black by the blood and quietly sank into the soil. Green rice leaves grew in the soil. The rice leaves stretched into the air, as if to be firm. In a very short time, the paddy field experienced harvesting, death, and rebirth. The life and death of the paddy field were performed in front of people. This process was very continuous. The cycle of life and death became a perfect integration, without any clear dividing line. The iron sword flying in the paddy field did not find the dividing line either. The iron sword was still moving forward in silence. The paddy field grew rapidly, making a rustling sound. A hurricane came from the iron sword, roaring above the paddy field. The wooden sword was suspended in the air in front of Yisu, being blown up and down by the hurricane. In the raging paddy field, the wooden sword was like an inconspicuous boat. The boat had no power. It was swaying in the stormy waves with the help of the paddy field and the sword wind. No matter how big the waves were, no matter how strong the wind was, the boat did not sink. It was faintly discernible in the black sea water and the white waves, sometimes sinking and sometimes floating. A moment ago, the boat sank into the dead and cold bottom of the sea. A moment later, the boat floated to the surface of the sea and saw the blue sky of life. Because the boat had no deck or cabin, the boat was the wooden sword. The wooden sword was the simplest piece of wood. In the sea of life and death, the wooden sword was floating aimlessly. It did not seek life or death. Neither could it seek life or death. After a long time, the wind gradually stopped, and the paddy field became quiet, as if nothing had happened. Only the new green seedlings in the soil of the paddy field proved something. Yisu stretched out his hand and caught a few rice grains in the air above the paddy field. The freshly peeled rice was plump. It was roasted by the sun until it was yellow and fragrant. He picked up a grain of rice with his finger and put it in his mouth. He chewed slowly with a smile on his face. It had a genuine taste. More than 10 years ago, I traveled around many countries. I thought I had seen through life and death. Since then I had no more fear. What I thought was the direction of my sword, and my heart of sword was clear. Yisu scattered the remaining rice grains in his palm into the paddy field and said with a smile, "If it were me at that time, I would have to take your sword and I would lose." Until a few years ago, on the top of the snow-capped peak in the wilderness, I stabbed Mr. First with my sword through the air with the clear will of sword against the sky full of sunshine. Then I realized how wrong I was. Yisu stopped smiling and said calmly, "Because my sword, which I thought had seen through life and death, didn't hit Mr. First at all. It didn't even stir up the water in the pond. Because Mr. First was reading by the pond, he didn't see my sword at all. He didn't even think about it. At that time, I realized seeing through life and death is the same as not seeing through. Later, I went to Chang'an and lived in a dilapidated Taoist temple for a long time. I saw the Taoist temple collapse and the neighborhood's eaves break. I was no longer in the secular world, but in the secular world. I began to repair the eaves for the neighborhood. I built the Taoist temple brick by brick. Only then did I understand the meaning of breaking and building again. Yisu looked at the blood water at the edge of the paddy field and said, "Blood represents death, but the field watered by it is extremely fertile. The blood rice in this field will be very delicious next year. Destruction and rebirth. This is life. There is no death in the world." Second brother looked at him who was standing in the paddy field and suddenly said, "There is death." Yisu said, "I admit it. But at least it is not within the time limit of you and me." Second brother said, "In your mind, there is only life and death. How can you break through it? What the Buddhism and Taoism sects pursue is the final peace." Yisu said, "Breaking through life and death is for peace. But now I understand that death is eternal and life is luck. There are great joys and sorrows in between. Why must I be peaceful? That kind of peace is fake. Before life and death, there should be sorrow or joy. That is the real truth. This is my view of life and death now. This view of life and death is very simple. It seems to be powerless, but no external force can break it. No matter your iron sword or anything else." After hearing this, second brother was silent for a moment and said, "You are close to the Tao." Yisu said, "I haven't reached the Tao." Second brother said, "However, Your Tao has deviated from the Tao of Haotian. Yisu said, the Tao is in the heart of heaven. Maybe this is the Tao that Haotian wants me to understand. Second brother said, if Haotian says that your Tao is not the Tao, what will you do? Yisu looked at the scattered rice at his feet, and the new green seedlings in the soil. After a long silence, he slowly raised his head and said calmly, I still have my sword. He reached out to the golden sea of rice. He held the wooden sword. Everyone had his own Tao. It had nothing to do with faith, but it didn't mean that he was not pious. It was just that people like Yisu would inevitably follow his own path. Second brother's question was a real question. Yisu's answer was also a real answer. He was ready. This represented a shocking fact. If Haotian agreed with his Tao, he would still be pious. If Haotian didn't agree with his Tao, he still had his sword. Because what was done could not be undone. He was willing to be the fool who carved the boat to seek the sword. Yisu was a genius of Haotian Taoism, and the firmest believer of Haotian. Otherwise, the Abbey Dean wouldn't have accepted him as a disciple. No one knew when he had undergone such a change. Was it on the snow-capped peak in the wilderness, or in a small Taoist temple in Chang'an? In any case, he held his sword. This sword dared to ask heaven. How powerful it must be. Now he was still a believer of Haotian, the wayfarer of Haotian Taoism. He didn't need to ask heaven for this sword. He came to ask Junemo. Would Junemo be able to handle it? Shaking my head. It's too hard to write. It's too hard to write recently. My IQ is really annoying. I frowned and scratched my hair to write. I hope everyone thinks it's okay. There's still one more chapter. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 767. Junemo and Yisu were both proud and powerful people. However, no one knew whether they were powerful because of their pride, or because they were powerful. 2 years ago, they met in the Lank Temple in the autumn rain. They fought each other proudly, and did not look at the rain or the sword. But because of the Buddhism sect, they did not enjoy themselves. Today, they met again and each made a sword move, sharing the autumn scenery in front of the verdant canyon. The third sword was about to come. It was just the third sword. It seemed that the battle had just begun. But both the two people fighting, and the hundreds of thousands of people watching in the field felt that this was the sword that would decide life and death. 18 years ago in the wilderness, at the other end of the black line, because of the son of Yama, Yisu's Taoist heart was stimulated, and he used the most powerful sword move in his youth. He cut the small tree into 53,333 pieces. After that, he traveled around various countries, and his state increased again. The wooden sword in his hand became slower and slower. In an instant, thousands of swords became thousands, hundreds, and finally only one sword. Because one sword was enough. As the autumn wind blew, the chi of heaven and earth in front of the verdant canyon seemed to be attracted by the wooden sword, and rushed in from all directions. The sunlight falling from the sky was refracted into strange shapes, as if thousands of horses were galloping. Frightened by this, countless golden rice grains were blown away by the wind, heading north. A golden wave was born in the field, and the wooden sword moved between the rice waves like a swift boat. Yisu did not stay there. His clothes fluttered, and he followed the wooden sword. The golden waves pushed the boat like wooden sword. Under the influence of the majestic chi of heaven and earth, it became faster and faster. It was about to become a flash of lightning. But Yisu's figure always followed the sword shadow. No one could fly so fast. Riding on a sword was just a legend. To be more precise, except for the headmaster, there was no such legend in the world. Yisu was not riding on a sword. The wooden sword was the boat. He was on the boat. The boat carried him. He was not the one pushing the boat. There was a strong wind in the rice field. Yisu disappeared. The next moment he came to Junemo. He held the handle of the wooden sword. He bent his knees, lowered his waist, straightened his elbow, and did not turn his wrist. The wooden sword pierced Junmo's left chest. An incomparably bright and wholly divine light shone on the blade of the sword. The sun above the verdant canyon seemed to dim a little when he struck with his sword. It was not Tianqi, but the fusion of the sword and heaven and earth. He had transformed Haotian's will into his own sword will. This was the will of the heavens. The wooden sword contained heaven's will. How could he avoid it? The wooden sword that contained the will of heaven was even harder to answer than the iron sword from before. Life and death could be ignored, but heaven's will could not be avoided. Junmo remembered the sentence his teacher had repeated many times. There was no omniscient and omnipotent existence, except for Haotian. He knew that he could not avoid Yisu's sword, so he did not dodge. He didn't even look at the wooden sword that was stabbing into his chest. Instead, he raised his iron sword and chopped down. Chopping was a very simple action. What he did was very simple. He just chopped down. If the question was difficult to answer, then he would not answer it. Just like the calculation problem he wrote for Chen Pippi before he entered the second floor. It was too complicated to calculate, so he did not calculate it. If the knot was difficult to untie, then he would not untie it. Just like how Teek tied his hair into a knot because the bath water was cold, it was too troublesome to untie, so he did not untie it. If the youngest brother did not answer, then he would use the sect rules to deal with him. If the seventh sister did not untie it, then he would cut it with scissors. If the wooden sword was difficult to answer, then he would not answer it. If it was difficult to avoid, then he would not avoid it. He held the iron sword, like picking up the sect rule ruler and picking up scissors, and then he chopped down. Junmo had always regarded the youngest uncle as his idol. He had not learned the Great Spirit, but he had learned the Haoran sword. The Great Spirit was about moving forward bravely. The iron sword in his hand seemed to be able to lift up all the boulders in the verdant canyon. It was extremely magnificent and made people feel relaxed and happy. In front of this simple and carefree iron sword, there was no God or Buddha, nor heaven. Junmo looked calm. He was confident that his iron sword could cut Yisu in half before the wooden sword reached him. This was not a mutual destruction, but a test of each other's courage. Courage was a kind of pride. Everyone knew that the second brother of the academy was the proudest person in the world. He was the bravest man in the world. The blood in the field in front of the verdant canyon, and the countless cavalrymen who died under his sword had all proved this. Yisu was also very proud, because of the pride shown by Junmo at this time. He did not dodge. The wooden sword moved forward and pierced Junmo's left chest. The seemingly blunt and edgeless wooden sword instantly sank into the charred black armor. The hidden talisman lines under the armor suddenly lit up, emitting a strong aura. The iron sword fell, but did not cut Yisu's neck, because it was blocked by the scabbard on his back. In the blazing light, the seemingly inconspicuous scabbard was like a sail in the raging sea, blocking the power of the wind and giving the boat strength to move forward. The tip of the iron sword pierced into the scabbard. Because the sword was wide and straight, it could not pierce through. All of this was real but also not real. The iron sword was not an iron sword. The wooden sword was not a wooden sword, and the scabbard was not a scabbard. The most basic structure of these things was filled with endless chi of heaven and earth. This was no longer a battle between swords, but a battle between psyche power, a battle between two worlds. Endless chi of heaven and earth violently rushed in, and was instantly swallowed by an invisible vortex, entering the world of the two, and then violently exploding through the sword or the scabbard. The chi of heaven and earth in front of the verdant canyon was compressed to the extreme, and the refracted light became even more distorted. Because of the compression, the chi of heaven and earth began to rub against each other, producing scorching flames. If Yisu's sword at the beginning was like a small sun in front of the verdant canyon, then a real sun seemed to be born in front of the verdant canyon at this time. Endless light and heat sprayed into the field. What a dazzling scene it was. The hearts of those who saw this scene would sway. Unfortunately, just like when the headmaster killed a god in the wilderness, because the light was too bright, few people could see this scene. Lu Bai could see it. So could Yi Hongyu. She had been silent in the sacred sedan with her head down, as if she did not care about the situation in the verdant canyon. Finally, she could not help but look up. In the light, Junmo's iron sword continued to press down. With a light hiss, the scabbard on Yi Su's back was torn open. Yi Su looked indifferent, and the wooden sword in his hand continued to move forward. The wooden sword shortened inch by inch, and part of it entered Junmo's chest. More of it was crushed into the finest powder, and then it burned fiercely like a candle. The current situation depended on whether the iron sword would break the sail first, or the wooden sword would break the armor first. The candle would eventually turn into ashes. The burning wooden sword became shorter and shorter, but it still did not break Junmo's armor. In the blazing light, Yi Su's face became transparent, and there was still no expression on it. He continued to move forward with the sword. In the end, there was only a hilt left, a bare hilt. With a clear roar, Yi Su slammed the entire sword hilt into Junmo's chest. In the past, his wooden sword had no hilt or scabbard. Now his sword had a hilt and a scabbard, because over the years, his cultivation had been regressing. He was moving forward and backward. From 10,000 swords to one sword, from seeing through to not seeing through, from the outside world to the inside world. But in this battle today, he had been moving forward, and had not taken a step back. His scabbard was the bond he had comprehended in the world. His sword hilt was all his spirit on sword Taoism. He used the scabbard to bind the edge of the iron sword, and then slapped all the sword style into Junmo's chest. Junmo's cultivation over the years was as simple as his iron sword. Forward, forward, and forward. There was no retreat, and there was no return. He advanced towards the peaks one by one. Just as Yi Su slapped the hilt into his chest, he suddenly let go of the sword hilt. The iron sword was too wide and straight, like his eyebrows. It could not be in the world or in the scabbard. At least in a short time, he could not break Yi Su's scabbard. Just like solving a problem, he would not break it. He let go of the sword hilt, and made a concession for the first time in his cultivation. But his left foot, in the sky full of light, took a step forward. His right hand clenched into a fist, holding the infinite light in the autumn wind, and smashed toward Yi Su. Junmo, who was moving forward, made a concession for the first time. Yi Su, who retreated in order to advance, moved forward resolutely. The two peerless geniuses of the cultivation world, in this thrilling battle, chose the other's best method at the same time. But no one knew who would win in the end. When the sword hilt sank into the scorched black armor, a tearing sound was heard in the whole field. It seemed that the sky was torn apart by someone. Junmo's armor did not change much, and there were some tiny sawdust left on it. Behind him, there was an extremely terrifying sword essence. The sword style pierced into the verdant canyon, piercing a deep hole in the cliff. Just the overflowing sword style had such amazing power. What would Junmo, who was facing all the sword style, do? Almost at the same time, Junmo's fist landed on Yi Su's body. His fist held infinite light, which was the chi of heaven and earth in front of the verdant canyon. And in this chi of heaven and earth, there was an unimaginable amount of sword style. The sword style of the iron sword even contained Yi Su's own sword style. Junmo let go of the iron sword, and then held countless swords. When his fist landed on Yi Su's body, it felt as if 10,000 swords had landed on Yi Su's body. The spring wind blew the willows, and the thin leaves fell into the water. The morning sun rose, and the lake glowed with golden light. On the winter snow lake, the wind was like a knife. It was quiet in front of the verdant canyon. Countless pairs of eyes fell on that place again, looking nervously at the two people standing opposite them. After an unknown period of time, Yi Su suddenly coughed, and there were countless fine cuts on his plain clothes. He looked at Junmo and said with emotion, "If you didn't have this armor, I wouldn't have lost." There are no ifs in this world. There was no joy on Junmo's face, and he said indifferently, "If you want to say if, then if I don't have armor and you don't have scabbard, I win." If you don't have swords and I don't have swords, I win. If it were 18 years ago, I would have won. If it were 18 years later, I would still win. He finally said, so no matter what, I win. There are no ifs. See you tomorrow. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 768. Yisu asked, can we reach the end of the cultivation path by relying on external objects? Second brother said, Haotian Taoism pays attention to nature. That is wrong. Yisu was slightly stunned and asked, why do you say so? What are external objects? If you and I are considered external objects, then the armor is an external object, the sword is an external object, and the aura between heaven and earth is an external object. However, everyone is using them. The second brother said, travel thousands of miles with the help of a carriage and a boat, and start farming with the help of a knife and fire. There are few differences between humans and animals, but they are good at using things. This is why humans are humans. How can they be called things? These simple words made Yisu ponder for a long time. Then he sighed and said, I originally thought that you were upright, strict, old-fashioned, and didn't know how to be harmonious. But today, I know that you're the real understanding one. Second brother said, propriety is reason. After careful consideration, if you decide that a rule is reasonable, you will not retreat, even if there are thousands of people in front of you. That is propriety. I heard that Mr. Ku once said, I will retreat even if there are thousands of people in front of me, but I will not retreat. That's exactly what I mean. Yisu looked at him and said seriously, the academy has always been doing things that make you happy, because you believe that these things are right. However, the truth comes from Haotian, and the reason is judged by people. Different positions will bring different rights and wrongs. How do you judge whether it is reasonable or not? You are right. Different positions will bring different rights and wrongs. But if you choose a position, the right and wrongs will naturally be determined. That is the so-called reason. Second brother said, the position of the academy is the position of human beings. We have no love or hate for heaven and earth. We love things that are good for people, such as rice fields. We hate things that are not good for people, such as disasters. The same is true for rules. If there are benefits, we will abide by them. And if there are no benefits, we will abandon them. Yisu asked, the academy's reason comes from the pros and cons? Second brother said, yes. Yisu said bitterly, isn't that a little too realistic? Second brother said, all the love and hate of human beings originate from reality. Yisu laughed at himself. He took out a handkerchief from his sleeve and wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth. The blood was very thick, just like the layer that settled at the bottom of the wine barrel. The second brother knew that this person was in a bad situation. Seeing that he was deep in thought, he thought about his view of life and death and Taoism. He wanted to say that if something happened, he could go to the academy to hide. But he knew Yisu's pride, so he only said, take care. Hearing this, Yisu laughed and said with a happy expression, I've traveled around various countries and cultivated for many years. Finally, when I'm in the autumn of being crippled, I'm able to receive Junmo's blessing. I didn't let myself down. With that, he turned and left the verdant canyon. Second brother looked at that lonely figure and slowly inserted the iron sword in his hand into the field beside him. With this movement, countless cracks appeared on his armor, and then pieces fell off. The blackened metal fragments looked like the common broken tiles in Chang'an City. After a while, pieces of armor were piled up around second senior brother's feet, and his clothes were soaked in blood. To the north of the field was the Green Mountains and the verdant canyon, and to the south was the military camp that stretched for more than 10 miles. Yisu didn't go north or south but east. He kept walking along the Green Mountains until he came to the Great Swamp. After passing the Great Swamp by boat, he would arrive at the Kingdom of Song, and then the sea. He didn't know why he was walking in that direction, but he vaguely felt that there was something or someone in the East Sea or the kingdom of song that was attracting him. Somewhere in the wilderness, Yisu's path was blocked. What stopped him was a flower of blood. The ink-red robe of judgment fell quietly. Yi Hongyu asked, "Where are you going?" Yisu looked at her and said with a smile, "I lost, so I'm going to relax." Yi Hongyu said, "You should know that you're seriously injured. If you don't get treated soon, it will be very troublesome. The Jisho Abbey is in the south, and the Divine Hall is in the south. Why are you going east?" Although Yisu didn't see it, he guessed that the two hands in the robe of judgment had clenched into fists. He felt the anger in her heart and felt warm. He said with a smile, "I've already become a cripple. How can I be cured?" Yi Hongyu's fists were indeed clenched. She was indeed very angry. After hearing this, she became even angrier. She was so angry that her body trembled, and the blood-red robe fluttered in the autumn wind. He was her brother, the person she respected the most in her life, her idol, and the goal she had been chasing since childhood. She would always look at his back, wanting to catch up but never able to. Even though she had become the great divine priest of judgment, she was still the little girl who followed her brother and cried. However, at this moment, he said that he was a cripple. How could you be a cripple? How could you admit that you were a cripple so easily and calmly? Even if you can't cultivate, and are ordinary from now on, you are still extraordinary. How can you be disheartened? Where did your pride and confidence go? There was no emotion on Yi Hongyu's face, but her voice was trembling. Yisu looked at her quietly and said, "I'm neither Ningke nor Longqing. I have nothing to do with Yama, and Haoyan will not bless me. I'm just the Yisu who cultivated diligently and lived peacefully. That's why I'm a cripple. My snow mountain and ocean of chi have been destroyed. I'm just an ordinary person now." "I know why you're angry," he continued with a smile, and his expression became very gentle. "When I stopped you from killing Longqing by the Northian Lake, you began to suspect me, and you were angry because of my lack of courage. You are my sister, but I'm actually weaker than you. This is indeed something to be angry about. However, I have to remind you that I actually began to suspect you a long time ago, and then I failed today. At this moment, I can't help but wonder if this is Haoyan's punishment for me." Yi Hongyu's expression changed slightly. Yisu suddenly laughed and said, "Why are you still thinking about these meaningless things at this moment? I had a good fight, and that's enough." Yi Hongyu said, "Only victory can make me feel happy. That's you and Ningke, not the rest of us." Yisu said with a smile, "People like me and Junimo are still a bit old-fashioned after all." Yi Hongyu did not know what to say. She and Ningke would probably never understand why the Battle of Verdant Canyon would end up like this. Yisu looked at the green mountains not far away and said calmly, "I used to want to be famous when I was young, but I was lucky that I didn't get it. Therefore, I spent my life on the sword. In terms of swordsmanship, I can rank in the top 3 in the world. Unfortunately, all 3 of us are in this field. Failure is not scary. I've been defeated more than once over the years, but today's failure was the most thorough. However, I don't think it's sad. Instead, I think it's a good thing." Yisu looked back at Yi Hongyu and said with a smile, "The academy is essentially the way of entering the human realm. So the way of the academy is based on reality. Although I lost, I vaguely understand something. Liu Bai is about to fight. You should go to the Verdant Canyon to watch the battle, because this battle is very meaningful to you. What about you? From today on, I will be an ordinary person. The word sword has finally left my life. It no longer means anything to me. I will have more time to think about other things." Yisu said, "Continue to pursue the way of the sword. One day, you will surpass me. In fact, I've been waiting for you to surpass me all these years. Unfortunately, I've fallen behind now. I hope you can forgive me for this matter." After saying this, he reached out with a smile and took off Yi Hongyu's divine crown. Then, he ruffled her black hair like a bird's nest, looking very childish. Yi Hongyu's body suddenly tightened. She was not used to this action. For so many years, Yisu had never done such a tender action to her. She was very nervous, but also very warm and satisfied. So she obediently lowered her head. Yi Su left. After a long time, Yi Hongyu raised her head, still longing for the previous feeling. She looked at the gradually disappearing figure, and the sadness in the depths of her eyes disappeared. More than 10 deacons of the Judicial Department of the West Hill Divine Palace and several West Hill Divine Guards appeared around her. "Protect him," she said expressionlessly. Then, she turned around and walked toward the verdant canyon. She was not angry, because it was a fair battle. Her brother had gotten what he wanted, so he was happy. And as Yi Su had said before he left, it was time for Lu Bai to take action. Because Jun Mo, who had just defeated Yi Su, was undoubtedly the most powerful Jun Mo. Second brother sat under the canopy, quietly looking at the direction of the field. Muyu carefully picked out the armor pieces that were left on his body. Then, she took off her helmet and began to comb his hair again. Obviously, she was not used to it. Wang Qi held a jar of medicine in his left hand and a paper bag of white sugar in his right hand. He said, "This medicine is very strong, so it is very bitter. If you can't drink it, you can swallow it with the sugar." Second brother looked at the white sugar in his hand and said unhappily, "Life and death don't matter, not to mention bitter medicine." After saying this, he took the medicine that had been cooled to the best temperature from Wang Qi's hand and swallowed it like a warrior drinking wine. His expression did not change, but his eyebrows slightly trembled. For him to be unable to control his expression, one could imagine how unpleasant the black medicine must be to drink. Wang Qi handed over the paper bag with a bitter face. Second senior martial brother finished his candy and combed his hair into a bun. Muyu waved the mirror in front of him, then put it away and helped him tie the crown. The iron sword was constantly knocked on the stove, and sixth brother was sweating profusely. Muyu asked, "Do you want to take a break?" Second brother stood up and put on the academy uniform with her help. He said, "No, I can't." He could not rest, because he would be discouraged if he rested. He could not rest, because his opponent would not let him rest. A carriage came from the south and went straight to the verdant canyon. The carriage was very quiet. There was no coachman. He was in the carriage. "It's too late. I only wrote 1 chapter today. I still owe 7,000 words. I will write 3 chapters tomorrow. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation." Chapter 769. The carriage stopped in the field in front of the verdant canyon. The carriage did not have to come, but it still came. This sentence had 2 meanings. The person in the carriage did not have to come, or the person's sword did not have to come, because that person's sword could reach tens of thousands of miles away. The person in the carriage was Lu Bai. He was recognized as the most powerful person in the world of cultivation, and was called the Sage of Sword. He was a real powerhouse. Even those unworldly sublime beings in the unknown place were not his match. Especially when he held the sword in his hand, the area in front of him was his absolute territory. Even the Abbey Dean of Jisho Abbey and eldest brother could not enter. Many people, including second brother, thought that with Lu Bai's peerless talent, he could surpass the threshold of the 5 states if he wanted to. It was just that he did not want to. Lu Bai's voice came from the carriage. "Do you want to rest for a while?" Second brother looked at the carriage hundreds of feet away and tied the rope around his neck with his slender fingers. He said, "I don't know if I can still be as confident after a rest." Lu Bai said in the carriage, "Then I won't rest." Second brother said, "If I had fought with you 2 days ago, I would have lost. Thank you for waiting until now." Lu Bai said, "I also want to thank you for sparing the life of a useless disciple of the sword Garrett." The conversation in front of the verdant canyon was very calm, gentle and full of kindness. No matter how one listened, one could not feel the tension of swords drawn in life and death at any moment. There was no hatred between the academy and the sword Garrett. Although Lu Yiqing was blinded by Ning Ke, it was a fair duel. With Lu Bai's temperament and identity, he would not be angry. This was something that the academy did not understand. Second brother looked at the carriage in the field and asked, "Why did you come, sir?" The carriage was quiet. After a long time, Lu Bai's answer came. Even the headmaster of the academy could not do it. What can I do? Second brother was silent for a moment and said, the headmaster is right. He is indeed not omniscient and omnipotent. He probably did not expect that after he left, the confidence in the world would be greatly weakened. Besides, I am a visiting professor of the Divine Hall. Lu Bai's voice came from the carriage. The whole world is against the Tang Empire. As a person of Jin, I have to show my attitude. It is also my wish to fight with the academy. Right now, only you and Li Man are worthy of my attention. This sentence came from the Sage of Sword, Lu Bai, which showed his respect to the academy. Second brother didn't agree. He shook his head and said, if there's a chance, I think third sister would like to learn from you. Hearing this, Lu Bai fell silent. The carriage became quiet again. After an unknown period of time, his somewhat shocked voice came from the car. Lin of the academy. Second brother said. Third sister doesn't use this name anymore. Lu Bai was indeed the most powerful man in the world. Whether it was wisdom or thinking, he was as fast as his sword. He deduced that the mysterious 23-year cicada cultivation was in the academy. Without a doubt, this was the most shocking piece of news in the cultivation world in over 20 years. Even he couldn't help but feel extremely shocked after hearing this secret. It seems that Haotian Taoism underestimated the academy. Lu Bai said, Xiong Chumo, that idiot, would definitely lose in the academy. But I didn't know that he was also in the academy. Now that I think about it, his ending must be worse than I thought. This sentence also had two layers of meaning. Lu Bai thought that the 23-year cicada cultivation was stronger than the hierarch of the divine halls of West Hill. As for himself, of course, he was stronger than the hierarch of the divine halls of West Hill. However, the general trend of the world is like a surging river that never returns. If you follow it, you will prosper, and if you go against it, you will perish. Even if Lin Wu is in the academy can't go against heaven. Lu Bai's voice came from the carriage again. Under the Abbey Dean's attack, your senior brother can only hold on for 3 more days. The Buddhism sect hasn't taken any action yet. Today, Junimo, you and I will fight. No matter what, you can't fight anymore. The Verdant Canyon will open, and the army will march north. The Tang Empire and the academy will perish. Second brother said emotionlessly, you are not a mediocre person. Why would you say such meaningless words? If everything in the world is destined, why do you come to the Verdant Canyon? Why do I come to the Verdant Canyon? Why do we stand in front of the Verdant Canyon? Why does the Verdant Canyon have to see us? Lu Bai said, these are kind words. After all, we still have to discuss things with swords. Second brother asked, when do we start? Lu Bai said, your sword is still being repaired. It won't be too late to repair it. At this moment, a muffled sound came from under the iron canopy. The heavy iron hammer collided with the fiery red iron sword. Then, the hot sword entered the water with a sizzling sound and white mist. Second brother reached out and took over the repaired iron sword. He said, the sword is repaired. Very good. The cyan curtain of the carriage moved slightly and was lifted by a hand. It was a big hand with slender and strong knuckles, which was suitable for holding a sword. Lu Bai walked out of the carriage. This sword sage, who was worshipped as a god by countless swordsmen, did not look special. His features were slightly sunken, and his facial lines were well defined. However, he was just an ordinary middle-aged man. Ordinary was not only a description of him, but also the aura that he exuded. The aura that he exuded was also very ordinary, and did not seem to be similar to the legends. This was because his spirit and aura were not in his body, but in the sword. The sword was at his side in its sheath. In novels, legends, and unofficial history, we can often see the imagination of ordinary people about cultivators, or even the imagination of cultivators. They say that everything in the world is a sword, and that the strong can kill all the heroes in the world by picking a flower or a branch. However, these people who only know how to talk about swords are just laughable. Lu Bai looked at the iron sword in second brother's hand and said, "A sword is a sword. It can't be a flower or a grass. And it can't be a nothingness in one's hand. Because the sword must be hard, strong, straight, and sharp, so that it can travel outside the blue sky and fall thousands of miles away. Otherwise, it can't even cut the wind, and the friction will melt the sword. How can it break armor and kill people? When I see a person using a sword, I first see if he is using a good sword. Today I saw 2 good swords. Yi Su's sword is made of strange wood, which is the best choice in terms of material. However, compared with your iron sword, it is still lacking. Because the sword must be made of iron. Only when the iron sword is stained with blood can it be called iron blood. Only then can you kill people freely." Lu Bai looked at the fire under the canopy and the simple and honest 6th brother. He praised, "The academy is really a great place. I can't believe that someone can make such a good sword." Second brother walked to the field and said, "But the sword is used by people after all. Your swordsmanship is also very good." Lu Bai said, "All these years, I have been wondering who is stronger between you and Yi Su. Now it seems that you are stronger. Your sword is stronger, and so is your swordsmanship." Second brother said, "But you are the strongest." Lu Bai's expression did not change, because he had heard such comments many times, until no one in the world dared to comment on his sword. When he was young, he comprehended Tao by the big river. Since then, his sword aura had spread across the mountains and rivers. No one had ever dared to question his reputation of being the best in sword Taoism. Sword Taoism is about the sword and swordsmanship. I have always valued the sword, Lu Bai said. I trained the sword in the cliff cave of the sword garret for more than 10 years, and finally made a good sword. Then the headmaster borrowed it. Although it was a pity, it was an honor for the sword to be used by the headmaster. Other than that sword, I have many other good swords, such as the one on my waist. It is also better than your iron sword. As for swordsmanship, I don't think I have any talent. I did not create the chi in front of me. This swordsmanship first appeared in the world, and it came from Mr. Ke. Second brother said. But you carried it forward, and it deserves the respect of all the swordsmen in the world. In the cultivation world, especially in the history of sword Taoism, Lu Bai was an unforgettable name, because he was the first great sword master who raised close combat to an absolute high position. In the past, sword masters in the cultivation world always paid attention to flying swords and controlling swords. In their view, controlling the chi of heaven and earth was the most strict distinction between cultivators and ordinary people. It was not until Lu Bai appeared out of nowhere and became invincible with the chi in front of him that all sword masters saw a new possibility on the road of cultivation. This change could even be said to be revolutionary. Because of this, second brother had respect for him. Lu Bai said, in the early years, I had been wavering between the two kinds of swordsmanship. It was not until the battle on the East Sea Dike that I realized this wavering had actually violated the original meaning of swordsmanship. At that time, I hurt Yin Se with my sword from 1,000 miles away. He rode a talisman toward the violent tide outside the dike. He was so far away, but the bald pin fell on my face. Lu Bai touched his eyebrows and smiled slightly self-mockingly. After that battle, I finally chose to hold the sword in my hand. The most fundamental difference between the two kinds of swordsmanship lies in whether a cultivator should use the chi of heaven and earth to control the sword, or use the sword to control the chi of heaven and earth. Each has its advantages and disadvantages, which are not obvious. But if you think carefully, you will find that the sword should use this kind of method. The Buddhism sect's copper bowl, prayer beads, cudgel and talisman can't work because these natal elements have no shape. But the sword has shape. The shape of the sword is suitable to control the chi of heaven and earth to hurt people. Because the sword is straight and has a sharp edge, so it can't be mediocre. No mediocre at all. You can't waver, whether it's 10,000 miles with the sword or 1 foot in front of you. Lu Bai said, you told Yi Su a lot of principles before, but I don't understand those principles. I only know the principles of swordsmanship. Since the sword is straight, it should pierce and pierce. Only the simplest is the most powerful. Second brother said, principles are things of the human world. You shouldn't stay in the human world, so you don't need to pay attention to them. But if you want to stay in the human world and use your sword, some principles still need to be followed. Continue to write the second chapter. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 770. If it can be broken, then it cannot be followed. This was Lu Bai's answer, and it was also the logic that the experts were used to. Second brother actually had the same idea. His iron sword was his own rule, but he was best at breaking other people's rules. So he continued to ask, since you want to break it, why not? Only he and Lu Bai understood the meaning of this sentence. At the very beginning, Lu Bai had already given his answer, but that answer could not explain his second senior brother. Lu Bai looked at the sky and did not say anything. Since there was no answer, he could only continue. In the end, he still had to use the sword to discuss the matter. The way of the sword is divided into sword and technique is divided into power and technique. Force is psychokinesis, technique is the means. When I first entered the awareness state, I saw the surging yellow river. My psyche power was the strongest in the world. I've been practicing the sword for 3 days, and I've left nothing out in 8,000 directions around me. Even a rainstorm can't touch my clothes. I'm the strongest in the world. Lu Bai looked at Jun Mo and said, if we were to fight on a normal day, you would definitely lose. However, in the past 2 days, you have killed 1,000 riders with your sword, and your chi has been growing. You have a 91 chance of winning. Now that you have defeated Yi Su, your sword will has reached its peak. So it is 82. However, the way of the sword is not based on numbers, so you will definitely lose today. Since it's not a matter of numbers, why bother counting? Second brother said. I've always believed that a battle that hasn't started can't be decided. Lu Bai laughed and praised. Good spirit. Jun Mo had already walked to the middle of the field, and was some distance away from the exit of the verdant canyon. In front of him were scattered arrows, and more than 200 swords that looked like dead branches in autumn. These swords were of different styles. The only thing they had in common was that these swords no longer had an owner. The battle of the verdant canyon had been going on for more than 2 days. He had blocked the continuous attacks of hundreds of cultivators, and seized more than 200 swords. These swords were stuck in the field like a sword grave, lifeless. Today, when he walked into the graveyard of swords, the 200 swords seemed to sense something and trembled slightly, like tree branches being blown by the wind, forming a forest of swords. It was very much like the forest of swords in the depths of the academy meadow. Jun Mo stood in the forest of swords with a solemn expression, and raised the iron sword in his hand. Lu Bai looked at the forest of swords quietly. He looked at the tall and straight man in the forest. His right hand stretched out his wide sleeve, and held the hilt of his sword. The ancient sword at his waist was silent. His palms were wide and thick, and his fingers were long and slender, which was most suitable for holding a sword. He gripped the hilt tightly, and there was not a single gap between them. It was as if his hand and the hilt had always been connected. The ancient sword in the scabbard vibrated slightly, letting out a joyful whistle. When he grasped the hilt, the sword in the scabbard became a part of his body. In other words, his body became an extension of the sword, and the two could no longer be separated. Grasping the sword with one's hand did not mean that the sword was in one's hand. When Lu Bai drew his sword, it could also be 1,000 miles long. Not walking the path of mediocrity, and only walking the path of absolute power, did not mean that he had to choose only one of the 2 sword-controlling methods. Back then, Lu Bai might have wavered, but now that he had reached the consummate realm, he was no longer troubled by this problem. How could the enlightened sword heart be covered in dust? He could choose at will. No one knew which sword-controlling method he would choose today. People only knew that when he drew his sword, no one could withstand it, because his sword was the fastest. except for the abbé dean and eldest brother, who were in the limitless state, and the chief monk of scripture, who could resist it with his body. No one else was worth mentioning. There was a universal truth. If Lu Bai drew his sword first, he would win. Junemo did not let Lu Bai draw his sword first. He chose to draw his sword first. Even if the iron sword was drawn first, it still might not work. Because Lu Bai's sword was too fast. So fast that it could reach first even though it was drawn later. Junemo did not choose to let the iron sword break through the air. Instead, he held the iron sword and swung it forward. Just like every time he swung his sword in the past 2 days. There was no expression on his face, and his academy uniform did not tremble at all. The wide and straight iron sword swung out with his sleeves naturally. It did not roll up any clouds, but rolled up countless auras of heaven and earth. There was no enemy, so where should the iron sword hit? There was indeed no enemy in front of him. But apart from the autumn wind, there were more than 200 sword hilts stuck in the ground. There was a forest of swords. The iron sword swung into the forest of swords and hit a waist sword. That waist sword was deeply stuck in the field. It suddenly received a heavy blow, and the sword hilt shattered. The sword body was bent to the extreme. The majestic power that came from the iron sword was like a hurricane that pulled it out of the soil. There was a shrill sound of air being cut. The waist sword turned into a sword light and flew towards the south. Junemo continued to swing the iron sword. The way he swung his sword was as natural as ever. Every iron sword carried the power of heaven and earth. Every time he swung his sword, there would be a waist sword in the field that flew through the air. It was as powerful as a crossbow. Whether it was sword momentum or swordsmanship, his realm was lower than Lu Bai's. No matter what sword technique he used, he could not be stronger than Lu Bai, nor could he be faster than Lu Bai's sword. So he chose a method that no one would have thought of. He did not hold his sword and move forward, nor did he fly away. Instead, he swung his sword. He waved his sleeves. It was not a slash, or a stab. It was a smash, or rather a hit. He gathered the chi of heaven and earth between the green mountains into the iron sword, and struck the waist sword on the ground. He used the power of the green mountains to help the sword fly through the air. Only in this way could he be faster than Lu Bai's sword. It was for the green mountains. In front of the verdant canyon, there were countless shrill sounds of swords. Dozens of swords leaped up from the blood-stained field like stones that had been hit hard. They turned into dozens of sword lights, and instantly disappeared. When they reappeared, they were already in front of the horse carriage. Flying swords were a way for cultivators to use their psyche power to control the chi of heaven and earth, and indirectly control their natal flying swords. For a powerful cultivator like Lu Bai, his heart was in the sword, and he could cut people's heads from thousands of miles away. Junmo's hit of the Green Mountains directly used the chi of heaven and earth on the sword. He skipped the part of psyche power, and turned the power of nature into a terrifying speed of the sword. The speed of the swords before the verdant canyon had already exceeded the cultivator's imagination of flying swords. No one had ever thought of controlling a sword like this, nor had they seen such a fast flying sword. These swords were so fast that the air in the field began to wail. They were so fast that the naked eye and perception could no longer capture their traces. They were so fast that it was as if they had disappeared. They were so fast that Lu Bai was not confident that he could fly out before these flying swords. So he did not control the flying sword. Instead, he drew his sword. The sword in his hand looked very ordinary, and there were even some traces of rust on it. Because he had not drawn his sword for many years, no one would have thought that Lu Bai's first sword would be defense. Lu Bai did not expect it either, because he did not expect that there was someone in the world who could think of a way faster than his sword. If it had been any other time, he would have praised and even admired Junmo's power. But at this time, he had to look serious because he had to face these swords. He was forced to defend. He had to defend. Therefore, he held his sword horizontally. The ancient sword was placed horizontally in front of him. It was not a bow, but a sword will. This sword will was like the ancient sword itself, absolutely straight, and did not tremble in the autumn wind. Only a magnificent city built on solid granite could have such a feeling. His sword was rusty, straight and indestructible, like an old city wall that had withstood the erosion of thousands of years of wind and rain. It looked dilapidated, but was actually still as strong as ever. At this moment, Junmo's first sword had arrived. The abandoned sword no longer felt lifeless. The blade of the sword rubbed against the slightly cold autumn air and glowed. It was not a warm red light but a cold light. The tip of the sword pierced through many layers of air and vibrated at a high speed. Even if there was a thick iron plate in front of it, it would be directly broken by the high-speed vibration. The sword was about to reach Lu Bai. It was about to meet the horizontal rusted sword. It sounded like the collective ringing of the ancient bells before the Lank Temple was destroyed. It sounded like a naughty child throwing a stone into a calm lake. A voice sounded in the air in front of Lu Bai. That voice was very clear, but also very far away. It sounded like a piece of paper being torn. It also sounded like a piece of paper being wet by the rain, and then being crumpled into a ball and thrown under the desk. The abandoned sword with unimaginable speed and power entered the air in front of Lu Bai and suddenly stopped. It did not meet the horizontal rusted sword. It was 1 foot away from it. It did not even touch Lu Bai's body. In front of Lu Bai, there seemed to be an invisible barrier. Junmo's sword with Qing Shan was stuck in this barrier. This barrier was the sword intent of the horizontal sword. It was the city wall. Junmo's second sword with Qing Shan followed closely. It also hovered in front of Lu Bai, unable to pierce through the barrier. No one saw that the rusted sword in front of Lu Bai was slightly bent, although the degree of bending was so small that it was almost invisible to the naked eye. Then came the third sword, the fourth sword. Dozens of swords broke through the air like lightning, and then hovered in front of Lu Bai. Every time the sword came, the rusted sword in Lu Bai's hand would bend a little. Until the end, the rusted sword made an obvious bend. However, there was no sign of it breaking. That was because the sword had suddenly become soft. The sword in his hand was no longer the mottled old city wall, but the river under the city wall. The moat. The river water was gentle, but it could protect a majestic city. None of the dozens of swords could pierce through the invisible barrier, and stood still in the air. This scene looked very strange and shocking. It seemed that there was a forest of swords in the air in front of Lu Bai. These swords were very close to his body, and the sharp sword tips with cold light almost touched his eyes. Anyone in this situation would probably feel afraid. But the expression on Lu Bai's face was still so calm, because his sword was in his hand. Then these swords could not get close to his body. Not close. Not far. 1 foot away. This was the 1 foot in front of Lu Bai. This was his world. This was the world of the sword in his hand. Wind could enter, so could rain. Other swords could not enter. I'm really going to vomit blood. I'll continue to write more. I don't know when the update will be. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 771. The swords could not advance, but they kept coming like wind and rain. Junmo waved the iron sword in his hand with the strength of a mountain. More than 200 swords stuck in the soil in front of him continuously flew into the air, drawing lines in the autumn sky. The entire field reverberated with the shrill whistling sound of the sword. The slightly chilly autumn wind fled in all directions. This extremely domineering scene shocked everyone's mind. Junmo's body and mind were very tired after defeating Yi Su with difficulty. But taking this opportunity, his sword intent was extremely strong. It was the most perfect moment. He was at his strongest. However, he still could not defeat Lu Bai. Lu Bai held his sword horizontally in front of him, looking calm. No one knew if he had moved the sword in his hand. It seemed that the rusted sword had been lying in front of him, quietly and motionlessly, or it might have moved countless times. At this time, more than 200 swords were floating in the air in front of him. Because there were so many swords, they blocked the sky and looked particularly eerie, even a little crowded. This scene was really shocking. Lu Bai put away his sword. The 200 swords in the air no longer had anything to support them, and fell to the ground with a loud bang. Like a pile of firewood that was not tied up tightly, they scattered to the sides. Lu Bai looked at Junemo and remained silent. There was no longer any admiration in his eyes. Admiration was the comment and recognition of the weak by the strong. After the attack of the sword rain, Lu Bai confirmed that Junemo was qualified and capable to fight with him on an equal footing. So he could not admire him anymore, he could only respect him. Lu Bai's greatest respect for his enemy was the sword. However, he did not have time to use his sword, because Junemo used his sword again. This time, Junemo did not use his own iron sword, but the discarded swords that he had taken away. The scattered swords in front of Lu Bai were still bouncing, and then suddenly bounced up. More than 200 swords instantly turned into more than 200 sword lights, breaking through the air. In the field in front of the verdant canyon, in the autumn sky, they danced wildly and fell like lightning. They pierced Lu Bai. Lu Bai frowned slightly, and held his sword horizontally again. Swords could fly, but they relied on psyche power to control the chi of heaven and earth, and then control the swords. The more swords one wanted to control, the higher the requirement for the realm of psyche power. A natal item was a very difficult thing. There were very few cultivators in the cultivation world who would cultivate several natal items at the same time. Even great swordsmen in the see-through realm would only use their own natal sword. If he had to divert his attention to control more flying swords, it would be a very unwise choice. This kind of unwisdom lay more in the degree of difficulty. In the Battle of the Spring Breeze Pavilion that rainy night, Chao Xiaoshu, who was in the see-through realm, controlled 5 swords to kill the enemy. After that, it caused a long period of discussion in the cultivation circle. Everyone praised his talent, but also inevitably had some doubts. Now that Chao Xiaoshu had entered the knowing destiny state for a long time, the number of flying swords that he could control had already exceeded 5. But because it was a taboo to divide one's attention, he rarely used this method. But Junemo did it today. The swords danced in the sky in front of the verdant canyon, like a flock of birds, constantly falling at high speed. After being shaken off by the barrier around Lu Bai, they flew at high speed in the air, and then fell again. Some of the flying swords were straight and extremely fast, like lightning. Some of the flying swords were like soft brush strokes on paper, drawing circles in the air. Some of the flying swords had unpredictable trajectories, sometimes to the east, sometimes to the west, and sometimes to the east. They danced wildly like swimming dragons. The more than 200 flying swords seemed to have a life of their own. The swords kept flying, shuttling back and forth between the sky and the ground, reflecting the autumn sunshine around the field. The whole sky was flashing, and the scene was extremely beautiful and spectacular. Different from the battle with Yi Su, Junmo's performance at this time was gorgeous and extremely presumptuous. His psyche power rushed out like a gust of wind, controlling more than 200 swords accurately and valiantly from a distance of thousands of feet, and drawing a scene that stunned everyone. The West Hill Divine Palace Coalition army, watching the battle in the southern field, was shocked speechless, especially those sword masters, who were even paler, thinking, "Is he still a human?" Lu Bai's sword momentum was stronger. He could use his powerful psyche power to forcibly seize control of those flying swords, just like how Junemo dealt with those cultivators yesterday. Even if he could not succeed in controlling all of them, he could at least subdue most of them. But he was not willing to split his attention on this matter, because he was used to using only one sword, because only absolute simplicity was absolute power, and one sword could defeat thousands of swords. He held the sword horizontally in front of him, not caring about repeating his own moves. The flying swords between the sky and the ground could not come within 1 foot of him. Unlike others, Lu Bai was not shocked by this dazzling scene. On the contrary, he did not understand why Junemo used so many swords. Just like Junemo did not understand why Yi Hongyu used so many swords yesterday. Even at their state, it was no longer a taboo to use swords at the same time. But Lu Bai believed that Junemo would understand the difference between simplicity and power. There must be a reasonable reason for everything that did not make sense. Yi Hongyu used thousands of swords yesterday because she wanted to set up a confinement array. What did Junemo want to do? Or did he not want to do anything? He just wanted to use this method to make Lu Bai think for a long time. And even hope that Lu Bai would be a little distracted? Lu Bai did not panic. He stepped forward and walked toward the verdant canyon with steady footsteps. He was walking, and the sword in his hand was also walking. So the world within 1 foot of him was walking with him. The whistling of the swords in front of the verdant canyon became more and more shrill. More than 200 swords bombarded the ground like desperate birds, and there was a series of dull thunder-like sounds in the wilderness. Lu Bai's footsteps were still steady. He was the sage of sword. He was the most powerful man in the world. He looked like an ordinary middle-aged man. The sword in his hand was a rusty sword that was even worse than an ordinary one. He held the sword horizontally in front of him, and the way he walked even looked a little funny. Facing Junemo's gorgeous flying swords, his response was so clumsy. But no one could break it. Even if eldest brother stood in front of the verdant canyon, he could only avoid it, but not break it. Because he was walking with his own world. As long as the opponent was within 1 foot of him, he would definitely lose. Lu Bai walked towards the verdant canyon step by step. His footsteps were steady and slow, and his movements were clumsy. This clumsiness represented prudence. As the most powerful man in the world, this clumsiness was even more respectful. Respect for the academy and Junemo. This kind of clumsiness might also hide a deeper meaning. Lu Bai's world within 1 foot of him could not be broken, but he could avoid it and retreat. Heaven had eyes. This might be the last chance for the academy to leave. If Junemo and the disciples of the academy were willing to leave, then they would never have to face Lu Bai's world within 1 foot of him. They could be free and enjoy the world. But Junemo was not willing to retreat. He raised the iron sword in his hand. His choice had nothing to do with the Tang Empire or the academy. He was in high spirits and full of lofty sentiments. A gentleman should not walk on a stranger's path, whether it was close or far away. Let's not talk about other people's business. I'll kill him first. At the end I had written, in this life the ultimate pursuit is just a moment of youth. But I found it too sour, so I didn't put it in. As for the last word, yeah, I thought for a long time and still put it in. My friend in Beijing said that you can only be used after you. But who cares? To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chitian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 772. Like looking at an abyss or a raging river. I wrote this chapter very nervously, so it was very slow and late. I will write more after this chapter, but it will still be very slow. No matter how slow he walked, there would be a moment when he reached the end. Lu Bai walked to the verdant canyon and stopped in front of Junemo. He was more than 1 foot away from Junemo, but it was enough. The so-called 1 foot in front of him was just a vague concept. In fact, Lu Bai's absolute territory depended on his arm and the length of his sword. Wherever he held the sword, it was the world of the strongest in the world. The distance was perfect. It was neither too far nor too close, just right for him to cut. Distance was a relative concept. It was very fair for the two of them. So Junemo naturally felt that it was perfect. So he did not even think about it. He raised the iron sword and cut toward Lu Bai. He did not say anything, nor did he build up strength. He just swung the sword. It was clean and even a bit bright and fresh. It was just like the green mountains behind him that were still green in the late autumn. The iron sword fell, like a green mountain falling on Lu Bai's head. Lu Bai no longer held his sword horizontally, because his sword was also 1 foot in front of him. This was his first sword strike in the truest sense. Lu Bai's sword must be a sword. When the rusted sword in his hand fell, the mottled rust instantly disappeared. The sword suddenly shone, reflecting the flowing clouds in the sky and the green mountains in the wilderness. It was extremely beautiful. This sword seemed to take away all the light between heaven and earth and countless creation and nature. It was incomparably brilliant. The light could be dazzling, as bright as the sun, and people did not dare to look directly at it. However, this sword did not hurt the eyes of anyone watching the battle in the wilderness. Instead, people were intoxicated by it. People were intoxicated by this beautiful and moving picture. The celadon sky, the silky clouds, the warm sunshine, the beautiful wilderness, and a surging river. This river originated from the wilderness. It was originally a trickling stream, stubbornly breaking through the mountains of the Ueluan kingdom, flowing through the fertile soil and abundant rainwater in the primeval forest. It received countless tributaries of rainwater and became a big river, carrying the sand from the south. The river was dyed yellow, and it became more and more majestic. The turbid waves were monstrous, and the yellow river water continuously slapped against the black cliff rocks, stirring up thousands of mud-like waves. It was as if 10,000 horses were roaring in it, and the sound was astonishing. Between the black cliff rocks, a young man was practicing his swordsmanship. His expression was calm. The sound of the waves could not enter his ears, and the shaking of the cliff rocks could not move his footsteps at all. He was focused on nothing else. Heaven and earth trembled and lost color, but no one knew whether it was because of the surging river or the person practicing swordsmanship by the riverside. When Liu Bai entered the path of cultivation, he saw a surging river at the initial awareness state. Hence, he was recognized as a peerless genius by the cultivation world. Later on, he realized his swordcraft by the river. Hence his swordcraft was called the day sword. When the day sword was drawn, the river could be seen. Liu Bai's sword was the river. When he drew his sword, the river would appear. Everyone who saw this river would eventually be swallowed by the raging river water. A big river with wide waves. The muddy yellow water fell from the sky and became the Milky Way. It was as if a hole had been pierced in the sky, and countless rivers outside the dome fell like waterfalls. This river did not have any other aura. It was just powerful. The great river came crashing down. Junmo's eyes suddenly brightened. Looking at the turbid waves of the river, his eyes were still clear like a brook. He also raised his eyebrows. All these details proved that he was excited at this time. He had always been a person who could hardly be excited. In the eyes of Ning Kai and other younger brothers, he was a strict and old-fashioned man who would never be associated with excitement. Ever since he defeated Yi Su, the expression on his face hadn't changed at all. But this time, he was really excited. Because when he saw the surging river, he found that he was actually afraid. This emotion was very strange to him, so he was very excited. He finally saw the most powerful sword in the world. He waved the iron sword and chopped down at the river. The wide and straight iron sword, with the power of Qing Shan, chopped heavily into the muddy and surging river. The river suddenly split and rushed to the banks, revealing the bottom of the river full of sand and rocks. The next moment, the river rushed back again, covering the sand and rocks. Junmo waved the iron sword again. The river split again. He continued to wave the iron sword. The river continued to split, and then recovered. There were many times when the iron sword hit the bottom of the river. The iron sword cut deep sword marks in the mud at the bottom of the river, breaking thousands of rocks. The sword and the rocks collided, making a dull sound. It was like the sound of iron striking. Junmo continued to wave the sword. In a breath, hundreds of iron swords appeared. But they could not stop the surging river from flowing southeast. The river continued to flow. Liu Bai's sword also continued to move forward. The river that fell from the sky was the most magnificent scene that could be seen in the human world. Facing such a surging river, humans would subconsciously look up to it, and then be intoxicated. Even if they woke up, they would not have the courage to resist because of despair. This was the most powerful part of the day swordsmanship. His sword did not borrow the power of heaven and earth. His sword was a part of heaven and earth, and the most magnificent part. At this moment, his sword was the concrete representation of heaven and earth. In front of the river, Junemo could stand still and silently wave his sword to resist. He had already surpassed most cultivators in the world. However, the river was hard to stop, and this was far from enough. Lu Bai's sword style arrived. The river roared. The wind roared. The crown fell. The bun scattered. Junemo's black hair danced in the wind. The uniform on his body had long since been cut into countless small holes, and his entire body was covered in blood. But he did not feel embarrassed at all. He was still solemn, as if he was still attending the banquet. The banquet was not over yet. His expression was still focused, calm, and even a little dull. He continued to wave the iron sword. But this time, the iron sword was no longer swinging. It became very delicate. It was as delicate as the embroidery needle in Muyu's hand. Junemo began to embroider with the iron sword. In an instant, the iron sword in his hand trembled countless times. The river was Lu Bai's sword. The wind and waves were the places where the iron sword and Lu Bai's sword had met hundreds of times. Junemo carved words in the wind and carved flowers in the waves. He wanted to use the smallest tools to carve the most magnificent rivers and mountains. He wanted to use the most silent method to decorate the most magnificent scene, just like how he used time and rain to polish the green stone under the eaves. In the Battle of the Verdant Canyon, Junemo knew from the beginning that he would have to face Lu Bai. Just as Lu Bai had said, he was not as good as Lu Bai in terms of sword momentum or swordsmanship. He was not Lu Bai's opponent, so he had to find another way out. Lu Bai had once written a letter to Yi Hongyu. There was a sword drawn on the letter. Ning Ke had seen the sword. He had made a copy in exchange for the Howren sword technique, and placed it at the back of the mountain of the academy. Before going south to the Verdant Canyon, Junemo had looked at the paper for a long time before deciding on the sword style. This kind of sword style was completely opposite to his temperament. But this was the only way he had come up with after careful consideration. Just as Ning Ke had said, the people in the academy had always believed that if there was only one way left, it must be the best way. Moreover, he had told Yi Su that after careful consideration, if a rule was reasonable, he would not give in even if there were thousands of people in front of him. This was etiquette. So even if he wanted to oppose it, he still insisted. In order to defeat Lu Bai, Junemo had made ample preparations. He had displayed his swordsmanship to the fullest, from the most ferocious to the most subtle parts. This was indeed his most powerful moment. But the Yellow River was still the Yellow River. After all, Lu Bai was Lu Bai. He was not a willow branch by the river, a shepherd boy under the willow, a wild man on a sheepskin raft, a widow pushed into the turbid waves, or a rock in the river. He was the great river. No matter how freely Junemo's sword style was, it was still inferior to this great river. There was only a slight difference. The words in the air were not finished, and the flowers in the waves were still a petal short. The autumn wind closed the traces, and the waves restrained the sword flowers. His sword broke through the iron sword and came to Junemo. There was a soft swoosh. Second brother's right arm was cut off at the shoulder, and fell into the mountains. No one knew where it landed. The sword in Lu Bai's hand broke into two at the same time. If he had been faster for a moment, Lu Bai's sword would have broken first. Junemo could not be faster for a moment, so his right arm holding the iron sword was cut off. Countless tiny sword cuts appeared on his body. These small cuts were all from Lu Bai's sword style. His academy uniform was completely soaked, and blood kept dripping to the ground. Blood gushed out from the broken arm like a raging river. Looking at Lu Bai in front of him, Junemo's face was very pale. At this moment, his right arm was cut off, and the iron sword had flown away. There was only half of the sword left in Lu Bai's hand. A broken sword was still a sword, and it could still kill. Lu Bai did not stop because he could not stop. His sword was the day sword, and what fell was the river water. He could not stop until it was over. What was done could not be undone. Lu Bai held the broken sword and slashed at Junemo. The great river appeared again. The surging of the Yellow River was even stronger than before. Anyone who saw the great river would die. No one in the world could resist this great river. Because the water of the Yellow River came from the sky, It flowed into the sea and never returned. The broken sword was getting closer. One could even see the metal lines on the broken sword. Junimo knew that he was wrong. He had been wrong since the Battle of Verdant Canyon. More accurately, he had been wrong in the academy. He should not have looked at the paper or the sword. He should not have thought about what Lu Bai would do before deciding what he should do. That would make him lose his strongest thing. Maybe that thing was called confidence or pride. He should only think about what he should do, just like he had done in the past few years. What did it matter if his opponent was Lu Bai or someone else? Junimo thought as he looked at the river rushing towards him. If he did not look at the sword, it would disappear. This sword made people intoxicated when they saw the great river, and they felt despair. Then it would disappear. If he knew he was wrong, he had to correct it, no matter when or where. So facing the most powerful sword in the world, he closed his eyes. The great river surged and fell from the sky, as if it was going to destroy the entire field in front of the Green Mountain. Only he who did not see this scene did not feel the majesty of the great river. The turbid yellow river water was everywhere. If he did not see it, he would not be there. The broken sword in Lu Bai's hand slashed through the air. This was the first time the day sword had slashed through the air since it was created. Because the yellow river water came from the sky. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 773. No matter how vast the river was, it could not cover the whole world. But facing this river, no one could find a few dry mounds. Junimo didn't look at the river, but he could feel it. Thus, he found a foothold in the surging river, turned his body slightly, and landed on that spot. He opened his eyes again, and watched the river flowing under his feet like time. He did not sigh like his teacher, but there was a bright luster in his eyes. His cheeks were pale, but his expression was still so calm. A clear whistle burst out from his lips. It was like the cry of a young phoenix, or the first sound of a phoenix being reborn. Junmo's black hair danced in the autumn wind. He opened his arms, and his sleeves fluttered in the wind. Blood gushed out from his broken arm. His psyche power gushed out wildly into the surroundings. Under the iron canopy of the verdant canyon, a sword in the grate felt the call of the wild psyche power. With a swoosh, it pierced through the cabinet and flew out of the canopy, towards the wilderness. In the southern field, in the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army Camp, countless exclamations suddenly broke out. Cultivators from various sects suddenly found that their natal swords were out of their control. The crisp sound of friction rose and fell in the camp. It was the sound of swords and scabbards rubbing against each other. Countless flying swords flew out of their scabbards and flew toward the verdant canyon. In the depths of the Green Mountain, several fallen leaves gently covered a large iron sword. A broken arm was still tightly holding the sword hilt. Suddenly, the iron sword trembled violently and flew up again. The world around the field was filled with Junmo's wild and majestic psyche power. Countless swords, summoned by this psyche power, came from all directions as fast as lightning. They instantly crossed a long distance and came to the verdant canyon, stabbing Lu Bai. Lu Bai looked solemn. He put the broken sword in front of him and set up the near world again. Thousands of swords suddenly stopped in the autumn wind around him and hovered in the air. There were so many swords that they formed a huge sword ball, blocking the sky and looking particularly cold. It was full of killing intent. This was the world of swords. This was a world surrounded by swords. Lu Bai was among thousands of swords. He could not see the situation on the other side. And even his connection with the chi of heaven and earth seemed to be cut off. He could only calculate. Junimo gripped his own sword amidst thousands of swords. He used his left hand. There were swords everywhere in front of the verdant canyon. The chi of heaven and earth was in chaos. But he could accurately find his own iron sword. This was because his right arm was still attached to the iron sword, unwilling to part with it. Holding the iron sword was the same as holding his own severed arm. He pulled out his iron sword and stabbed at Lu Bai, who was surrounded by thousands of swords. Lu Bai couldn't see it and couldn't calculate it clearly, but he felt the sword. This was the strongest sword he had ever seen in his life. It was even more terrifying than the sword in the hands of the South Sea sword god, who had given him the title of Sword Saint. Lu Bai no longer hesitated. He no longer held his sword horizontally. There were no more city walls or moats. At the most critical moment, he only trusted the sword itself. At this moment, Jun Mo had successfully stimulated all of his battle strength and arrogance. He was confident that he was invincible. In front of the Day sword, anyone would be able to escape. No matter how terrifying Jun Mo's sword was, it was impossible for it to be a match for him. Lu Bai drew his sword. The great river surged across the plains. He was the Sword Saint. His sword was the Saint of Swords. When he drew his sword, there was only one sword left in the world. It was so close that it expanded. Hundreds and thousands of swords suddenly scattered, flying towards the green mountains and plains. There was nothing that could block Lu Bai's sight or his sword. But there was still a sword in front of the verdant canyon. The iron sword was held in Jun Mo's hand. Then it was held in Jun Mo's hand. This sentence was not repeated. It was the accurate reality. The one holding the hilt was a severed arm. Jun Mo held his severed arm. The scene looked bloody, but it was meaningless. Except that the iron sword seemed to have grown longer. Jun Mo drew his sword. He was focused and careful. Even though he was covered in blood, he did not waver. Lu Bai drew his sword. He started later but arrived first. No one in the world could be faster than him. However, there was only half a broken sword left in Lu Bai's hand. The iron sword in Jun Mo's hand was a bit longer than usual. There was a slight sound in front of the verdant canyon. It was like a drop of water falling into a furnace and touching hot red charcoal. The iron sword pierced into Lu Bai's chest. Lu Bai's broken sword was still a distance away from Jun Mo's throat. It was not near or far. It was exactly 1 foot in front of him. Lu Bai abandoned the sword. The broken sword broke again into countless bright pieces. The aura of heaven and earth on the sword was shaking. The field in front of the verdant canyon began to shake. There was a long howl. Lu Bai retreated in the howl. It came like the yellow river rushing into the sea, and left like a flood. Borrowing the aura of heaven and earth, he retreated dozens of feet like a ghost. Then he stopped. He began to cough. He coughed out blood. He looked at the sword wound on his chest and frowned. He finally understood why Jun Mo had to control so many swords. Because Jun Mo wanted him to calculate. Although he was the most powerful man in the world, he was not someone who could calculate everything. No matter how powerful he was, he could not calculate all the changes. Jun Mo did not need to calculate, because thousands of swords were fake. Only his iron sword was real. Even so, Jun Mo's iron sword could not get within 1 foot in front of him, until his arm was broken, and he was seriously injured. Jun Mo was in pain, angry and unwilling. He had been strict and polite for so many years. He had been restrained by his own rules for so many years. But now he finally broke out. He closed his eyes and dodged Lu Bai's fatal sword. He roared, shaking the green mountains and fields. Countless swords came. Lu Bai's sword intent finally had a gap. Jun Mo's iron sword pierced through the gap. Perhaps Lu Bai had purposely created that gap, because he believed that his sword was the fastest at such a close distance. But he did not think of one thing. Swordsmanship was divided into swords and techniques, and then into momentum and techniques. Besides speed, there was also length. Lowering his head to look at the bleeding wound, Lu Bai smiled. His smile was not lonely, but self-deprecating and emotional. No matter how he thought about it, he could never have imagined that the final outcome would be like this. He could accept that both sides were injured, but he could not accept the reason. The reason was ridiculous. The broken sword and the long sword met. For some reason, the one holding the broken sword stabbed his opponent to death. But for some reason, the one holding the long sword gained the advantage. This was a battle scene that ordinary people, who had just learned swordsmanship, could imagine. He and Jun Mo were the two strongest swordsmen in the world. But in the end, they used this method to put an end to the battle. He suddenly thought that a clear stream would become a turbid river, but it would become clear again after entering the sea. Could it be that the swordsmanship cultivation followed the same principle? I wrote these 2 chapters for 8 hours today. I can't finish them. I've seen some comments, and I'm not very satisfied with these chapters. What I want to say is that this is really a problem of my intelligence and ability. Everyone's ability has a limit, and it's impossible to write as well as you want. I can only say that I've done my best to write the chapters on the Battle of Verdant Canyon. There's no pretense. I've written it with all my might, so I'm satisfied with myself. I hope everyone is satisfied too. Good night. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 774. The sound of footsteps came from behind Junemo. Except for the 4th brother, who was holding the river and mountain sandbox. The rest of the people from the academy all rushed out from under the iron shelter. The 6th brother held the iron hammer and stared at Lu Bai, who was more than 30 meters away vigilantly. Bagong Weiyang and Shiman Buhua held the zither and the flute, and stood on both sides of Junemo. They all knew that even though Lu Bai was seriously injured, as long as he waved his sword, they would still die behind the iron shelter. But they still rushed over, because the 2nd brother needed them at this time. Wang Qi held the medicine box, and was preparing with a pale face. Mu Yu held the needle, and was ready to stop the bleeding for Junemo, but her hands were trembling. Looking at his broken shoulder, she felt as if her arm had been cut off, which was very painful. Junemo looked at the teardrop on her eyelashes, and stretched out his left hand to brush over the wound. As his fingers brushed the teardrop, several strands of pure qi of heaven and earth, like the most wonderful doctor's hands, covered his broken shoulder with an invisible net, and the blood stopped instantly. Wang Qi was slightly relieved. He poured medicine on his wound, and was ready to bandage it. Lu Bai looked at the scene more than 30 meters away, and did nothing. Suddenly, he had a deeper understanding of the reason why the academy was so powerful. He said, I have a few questions. Junemo asked the 6th brother to step aside, and looked at him not far away. Go ahead. Lu Bai asked. I gave you a chance at the beginning. Why didn't you retreat? Junemo said. When you challenged the sword god of South Sea, it was obvious that you were no match for him. Why didn't you retreat at that time? Lu Bai was silent for a moment and said, That makes sense. Junemo said, That's why I didn't retreat. Lu Bai sighed and said, You paid such a heavy price, but you still didn't kill me. Now that I think about it, I can't help but feel sorry for you. Junemo said, It's worth it to lose an arm for you to be seriously injured and unable to fight again. Lu Bai said, No matter how serious a sword wound is, it can be healed, but a severed arm cannot be regrown. Right now I can't fight, but it's only a temporary thing. You can't hold the sword in your right hand, but it's a permanent thing. Exchanging a lifetime's worth of experience for a moment's worth of experience, I have indeed lost. But in this battle of the Verdant Canyon, I have won. Even if I am half dead, I can still defend the Verdant Canyon, but you must leave. Junemo looked at him and said, Because you are too powerful. You want to do a lot of things. You value life very much. You are seriously injured, and have to go back to the sword tower to recuperate. Lu Bai looked at him quietly and suddenly smiled. He did not expect that at the moment when both sides were injured, the other party could actually see what he was searching for. He said, You should also value it. Junemo asked, Why should I value him? Lu Bai said, The 1,000 years of the Tang Empire cannot compare to a moment on the path of cultivation. In that case, apart from ourselves, what else can we value? Everyone's promise is himself. Valuing oneself is valuing one's promise. Junmo's gaze passed Lu Bai's body, the silent carriage, and fell on the mighty army of the Divine Hall in the southern wilderness. He said, I promise that as long as I am still standing, no one will cross the Verdant Canyon. Lu Bai said, "If you die in the hands of those rascals, it will be a pity. Do your best, don't ask about the road ahead, and don't have any regrets." Junemo said, "And even you can't kill me. Who can?" Lu Bai looked at him, who was covered in blood and holding an iron sword, and suddenly felt that he was looking at another person. "I seem to see Mr. Ko in the past." Lu Bai said, "Yesterday I felt regretful that I should have killed you at the beginning of the Battle of the Verdant Canyon. Now I feel lucky. Before you die, let's see you shine more brightly in this wilderness." After saying this, he turned around and walked towards the quiet carriage. As the carriage gradually moved away, Junemo withdrew his gaze and looked at his left hand. The ring finger of his left hand was tied with a red string. It was wet with blood and was a little tight. He continued to look down at the broken arm and the iron sword. He did not know if it was because he had lost too much blood or because his psyche power had been used up, but his face was very pale. Looking at the broken arm and the iron sword, he was silent for a long time. No one knew what he was thinking. At this point in the Battle of the Verdant Canyon, the disciples of the Academy and the powerhouses of Haotian Taoism were either dead or injured. The situation was in a stalemate and had reached the most difficult moment. However, the army was in the south, and everyone could see the final outcome. The West Hill Divine Palace was not satisfied. They had never thought that they would have to pay such a high price to pass through the Verdant Canyon. They did not expect that even the Sage of Sword, Lu Bai, could not succeed in one go. Hope eventually turned into disappointment. Some people found it hard to understand, and even had doubts. The new commander of the West Hill Divine Palace Divine Guards, Su Chun, was one of them. Su Chun was a trusted follower of the hierarch Lord of the Divine Hall. After Luo Kadi was shot to death by Ning Kai in the wilderness, he took over the position. Now his status in the West Hill Divine Palace was extremely high, only below the two great divine priests. Looking at the carriage that was slowly returning, his face became a little ugly. "Lord Sage of Sword, I need an explanation." Su Chen looked at the carriage and said, "You clearly have the strength to fight again. Why did you retreat?" The disciples of the sword Garrett, who were heading to the carriage, heard this and glared back at him. Su Chen's face was as cold as ice because he was really angry and disappointed. If Lu Bai was really seriously injured by Junmo's sword, then what was there for him to be afraid of? Moreover, Lu Bai's sword was already broken. A person without a sword could no longer be called the Sage of Sword. After a long time, Lu Bai's voice still did not come from the carriage. There was only a cough. Lu Bai was seriously injured and blood had entered his lungs. His pain and discomfort could be heard from his cough. Su Chen's eyes showed a hint of mockery. Lu Bai continued to cough, and the sound became louder and louder. Su Chen's pupils shrank, and the mockery instantly turned into fear and despair, because there was a line of blood between his eyebrows. The coughing continued to come from the quiet carriage. Every time Lu Bai coughed, there would be another line of blood on Su Chen's body, whether it was the armor with golden rune lines on his body, or his right hand, that had secretly grasped the hilt of his sword. After a cough, there was a line of blood. There was a series of crashing noises. Su Chen and his warhorse turned into dozens of pieces of flesh and scattered on the field. Blood flowed everywhere. Lu Bai finally stopped coughing and said, "Let's go." The disciples of the sword Garrett came to the side of the carriage and protected it as it walked out of the military camp. They looked around vigilantly. Countless eyes were watching the carriage. No one dared to stop it, no one dared to speak, and no one even dared to show any doubt in their eyes. Lu Bai and Junemo had fought and both of them were seriously injured. Junemo said that he was seriously injured and could no longer fight, but the word fight was only between the two of them. It was a conversation between the two strongest swordsmen in the world. It had nothing to do with anyone else. The goshawk had fought for several days and nights in the sky. Its feathers had fallen off, and it was covered in blood. Its sharp beak was worn out, and it seemed to be dying. But it was not an opponent that an ant could defeat. Lu Bai was seriously injured and did not have a sword, but he was still the strongest in the world. Looking at the carriage slowly driving out of the military camp, The people of the Divine Hall Coalition Army had complicated expressions. Some were in awe, but most of them were at a loss and afraid of what to do next. Even the priests of the West Hill Divine Palace had the same feeling at this time. Lu Bai, the most powerful on their side, was injured and left. What about the Verdant Canyon? Yi Hongyu looked at the leaving carriage through the heavy gauze and did not speak. The climax of the Battle of Verdant Canyon was the battle between Lu Bai and Jun Mo. She believed that she would not be able to see such a battle between two swords for many years to come. As for an idiot like Su Chun, she did not care if he died. She was more concerned about the aftertaste after the climax. She wanted to know how long Jun Mo, who was only half dead, could last. The horses neighed, and the cavalry was ready to go again. Then, like flowing water, they separated out of the military camp and converged in the field. They became a calm but powerful tide and surged toward the Verdant Canyon. The cavalry did not speed up and slowly drove toward the Verdant Canyon. They were afraid of the horrible sound of the zither and the flute. And the man they feared the most was already heavily injured, so they could deliberately slow down their speed, like a moving mountain range crushing over. This was the best opportunity for the coalition army to seize. Therefore, this attack was led by the commander-in-chief Bai Haixin. Almost all the elite cavalries were mobilized. They were determined to win. Thousands of cavalries stopped in front of the Verdant Canyon. The vanguard camp was not far from the iron shelter. It was the best distance for a charge. If the zither and flute sounded, the cavalries could dismount and fight on foot at any time. Bai Haixin lifted his visor and looked at the Verdant Canyon not far away. He looked at the man covered in blood and the iron shelter. His frosty face showed a trace of mockery. "You are now a cripple." He looked at Jun Mo and said, "So I will not accept surrender. Die." Hearing this, Jun Mo's expression did not change. Muyu was extremely angry. As the commander-in-chief of the coalition army, Bai Haixin should not have come here in person. But he thought that no matter how powerful a powerhouse was, he would be extremely weak after losing an arm. This was the best opportunity for the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army. They had to seize it. The problem was that the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army's morale was at its lowest. The headmaster's ascension to heaven had seriously affected the morale of Lu Bai and the Buddhism sect cultivators. Lu Bai, the Sage of Sword, had failed to kill this man, which made the coalition army's morale extremely low. That was why Bai Haixin had personally led the elite troops to attack the Verdant Canyon. That was why he had deliberately said such humiliating words. Of course, he had also carefully prepared for this. There were dozens of powerful military martial cultivators around him, and guards with big shields. He was not worried that he would be killed by the horrible iron sword. Jun Mo looked at the general in the army. He did not know who he was, but he knew that he should be a very important person. So he decided to kill this man. If it was any other time, he would definitely walk over with the iron sword without hesitation. But he was seriously injured, and his psyche power was exhausted. He was very tired. So he just stood there quietly and looked at Bai Haixin. He began to think about this problem. How could he kill this man? If it was in the past, he would have countless ways. But now he had to find a new way. He suddenly thought of the moment when Lu Bai retreated. That scene quickly replayed in front of his eyes, and then became extremely slow, and countless images superimposed. He saw it clearly. He raised his left hand, and summoned the autumn wind with the iron sword in front of the Verdant Canyon. The chi of heaven and earth was restless, and the cold wind blew. The river broke its banks and flooded. His body was like a feather, floating on the water, and instantly flying dozens of feet away. He looked at Bai Haixin in front of him, and waved his sword. Then he floated back and landed on the ground where he had been. Bai Haixin looked at the Verdant Canyon, and frowned slightly. He did not know what had happened. He only felt that his eyes were blurred, and did not know that there was a line of blood on his neck. Then he looked at his subordinates. It was a simple turn of his head, and he turned it back. His head separated from his body, and fell to the ground. Blood splattered. Screams were heard. Junmo's body shook slightly and his face became even paler. His spirit and psyche power were consumed even more in this simple move. He could fall at any time. He had already killed the enemy's commander. He never gave people a feeling of power and might. But he was a real warrior. A true warrior, even if he only had half his life left, would still take the head of a general in the midst of an army of 10,000. Screams of sorrow, and then the sound of hooves like a storm. The black mass of cavalry began to charge. The zither and the flute sounded, and the spring water gurgled. From time to time, some cavalrymen fell from their horses, and some horses screamed and fell to the ground. Then they were trampled into meat paste and blood by their companions behind them. The cavalrymen were not cultivators and could not use talismans. They could only fight with their lives. Baegong Weiyang and Shimin Buhua were also fighting. The strings of the zither were repaired by eldest brother, and the flute was unblocked by eldest brother. They were injured by the great divine priest of revelation. Although they were treated by eldest brother, they could not recover in such a short time. They lowered their heads and played the zither and flute attentively. The zither strings were stained with blood, and the flute began to drip blood. Muyu stood under the eaves of the iron shelter, holding several arrows in her hand, and looking at the cavalrymen rushing over like a tide. The sixth brother stood in front of the shelter, holding a heavy iron hammer. The muscles on his arms were about to burst his clothes. The fourth brother held the river and mountain sandbox with trembling arms and a pale face. He knew that the academy was facing the greatest danger at this time, and might even be wiped out. But he could not help his younger brother and sister. Junemo waved the iron sword. He held the hilt of the iron sword in his left hand, but it was still powerful. Blood splashed, and heads were cut off. Countless cavalrymen fell under the iron sword. But there were too many cavalrymen rushing to the verdant canyon. He had just lost an arm and was seriously injured. Although he was like a reef in the black tide, he could not stop the tide from rising and drowning the reef. Junmo's figure was gradually swallowed up by the cavalrymen. Dozens of cavalrymen crossed the dimming iron sword and came to the verdant canyon. Muyu looked at the twisted faces of the cavalrymen and broke the arrows in her hands. A pure aura of heaven and earth overflowed from the iron shelter to the field. 5 deep ravines suddenly appeared on the field that was covered in broken arrows and blood. The 5 ravines just surrounded the exit of the verdant canyon. Those ravines were very deep and bottomless, but they were not wide enough to accommodate the hooves of horses. The front hooves of a warhorse stepped into the ravines, and were broken by the great force of rushing forward. Tragic neighs sounded one after another. In an instant, more than a dozen warhorses fell heavily to the ground. Several fierce shouts came from the cavalrymen of Divine Hall, and then they continued to charge. They knew it was the power of the tactical array. They had to kill the woman who presided over the tactical array as soon as possible. The sixth brother held the iron hammer and stood silently in the front. His burly body completely blocked the younger sister. More than a dozen arrows were shot at him, but he did not change his expression. The sharp arrows hit his bare chest, only leaving a few small white spots on his dark skin. A brave and lucky cavalryman crossed the 5 ravines and rushed to the iron shelter. The warhorse was extremely fast, and the strong wind blew against his face. The sixth brother raised the iron hammer and smashed it down. He had been doing this all his life. Even the powerhouses of the devil's doctrine could not avoid his iron hammer. Not to mention an ordinary cavalryman. The heavy iron hammer accurately hit the warhorse's head. With a crack, the horse's head suddenly burst open, and blood spurted out. The warhorse fell heavily to the ground, stirring up a cloud of smoke and dust. The sixth brother raised the iron hammer again, and faced the next enemy. No one knew how long the battle before the verdant canyon had lasted. The autumn sun gradually moved west, and the cold wind became colder. The sound of the zither and flute became weaker and weaker. Baegong and Shimin were pale and coughing up blood. Muyu looked more and more haggard. Wang Qi hid behind the iron stove nervously, and looked up at the sky from time to time, as if he was praying. Only the sixth brother kept waving his iron hammer. The ground was full of dead war horses with their heads smashed. The cold light of the iron sword could no longer be seen among the cavalrymen. Only the flying broken limbs and blood proved that the man holding the iron sword was still alive and fighting. The night gradually darkened. The West Hill Divine Palace lit torches and continued to attack the verdant canyon. Under the countless torches, the night seemed as bright as day. The zither and flute music in front of the verdant canyon became more and more chaotic. Baigong and Shiman were no longer pale, and their cheeks were flushed ominously. They no longer coughed up blood, because they could no longer cough it out. Muyu's hair was unkempt, and her psyche power was almost exhausted. Even the sixth brother's strong arms began to tremble, and the iron hammer was even slightly deformed. The fourth brother stared at the river and mountain sandbox in silence. Wang Qi stood up from behind the iron stove, looking at the night sky and murmuring something. They hadn't seen the second brother for a long time, but they knew that the second brother was still fighting. The iron sword was still there, because the verdant canyon was still there. The whole night passed. The story that happened that night, the persistence, it was hard to describe clearly with words. The disciples of the academy guarding the verdant canyon and the cavalrymen of the divine hall were on the verge of collapse. The morning came, but the sky was still dim. Wang Qi kept looking at the sky. His neck was already sore, but he didn't feel anything. All of a sudden he shouted. The sixth brother was slightly stunned when he heard the shout. He threw out the deformed iron hammer and knocked over a cavalryman who was rushing over. Then he quickly walked back to the iron shelter. The fourth brother's left hand left the river and mountain sandbox, and he spat out blood. But he didn't care. He took out a fu paper as fast as he could, and turned it into a breeze with all his psyche power. The breeze came to the iron stove. The sixth brother whipped the wind and frost with all his strength. The wind gradually became stronger. Then the wind came from the verdant canyon. The wind gradually became stronger. Wang Qi watched the sky for a day and a night, waiting for the wind direction he needed. At this time, the north wind had arrived. He took out the prepared powder from his arms, tore it apart with trembling hands, and sprinkled it on the fire. A slightly sweet smell, as the powder was evaporated by the high-temperature fire, filled the iron shelter, and then went to the fields in the south with the north wind from the verdant canyon. The cavalrymen of the divine hall were still charging toward the verdant canyon. Suddenly, they smelled a faint sweet smell. Then they began to bleed. Blood flowed from their eyes and nostrils. The blood they shed also carried a faint sweet fragrance. Before a cavalryman died, he suddenly remembered that he had smelled this smell. At that time, he was still in his hometown, and there was a beautiful girl selling white flowers on the street. This sweet smell was the fragrance of flowers. It was the fragrance of gardenia. It turned out that the fragrance of flowers could really attack people. It could really kill people. In front of the verdant canyon, the iron sword reappeared. Although it was already dim, and there were several cracks on the blade, but the appearance of the iron sword still meant death. Cavalrymen kept falling. Countless blood splashed into the sky and then fell down like a rain of blood. In the rain of blood, Junimo kept killing people. The wind blew, and the fragrance of flowers gradually dispersed. The cavalrymen gradually retreated, and there was finally a flat ground in front of the verdant canyon. Junimo stood there with the iron sword in his hand. There were corpses everywhere around him. No cavalryman continued to charge. The dark tide turned into a quiet sea. A general of the South Jin Kingdom looked at the tragic scene and suddenly felt very tired. Too many people had died that night. He knew that if they continued to charge, the academy would not be able to defend the verdant canyon. The fragrance of flowers would not last long, and the man with the iron sword would eventually fall. But he did not order his subordinates to continue the charge, because everyone's hearts were already cold, and they were already in despair. The tide could beat the reef for hundreds of millions of years, but no one could bear it. The general noticed that a few captains who were famous for their bravery were looking at the camp in the south. He knew that they were waiting for the signal to retreat, just like him. But there was no sound. They wanted to raise the reins and fight again, but they did not have the courage. No one knew who started it. Maybe it was just an inconspicuous cavalryman. The sound of hooves could be heard as they left the blood-stained verdant canyon and headed south. Then more and more cavalrymen silently left the verdant canyon. Junimo stood in front of the green mountain with his sword in one hand. He was covered in blood and his face was pale, but his expression was still calm. Magnificent was a word used to describe mountains and forests. Sometimes it could also be used to describe a person's temperament and appearance. Like him at this moment, looking at the tens of thousands of cavalrymen gradually leaving the verdant canyon, the iron sword in his hand finally fell slowly. He turned to look at the children under the iron canopy and calmly nodded to greet them. Then he looked up at the green mountain. In the morning light, the green mountain was very charming. Unexpectedly, the green mountain saw his response. This chapter could not be divided and could only be written down, so it was a little late. Ning-Kay had thought of this sentence when he passed the verdant canyon. This is the second brother I like the green mountain. Tomorrow is Saturday off. I wish everyone a happy weekend. If there are no accidents, it will be at midnight on Sunday. Also, I haven't asked for a monthly ticket this month, so I want to ask for it now. I really think it's written well. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chitian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 775. The three northern counties of the Tang Empire were shrouded in a bloody storm. This was the real battlefield. The cavalrymen of the Golden Tribe from the south of the wilderness fought with the cavalrymen of the Tang Empire in the fertile wilderness. The battlefield stretched for hundreds of miles. There were battles and deaths every second. On the battlefield, the priests of the Golden Tribe royal court and the cultivators of the Tang Empire kept fighting. The chi of heaven and earth trembled. Countless cavalrymen charged fearlessly. The wilderness had long been painted red. In the Pamir Mountains, the Tang Empire's Western Army, under the command of General Xu Chung, finally defeated the army of the Yueluan Kingdom on the plateau and won a decisive victory after sacrificing more than 20,000 soldiers. Due to the long journey and the shortage of supplies, the Tang Empire's Western Army did not return to the three northern counties. Instead, they entered the Pamir Mountains and attacked the Yueluan Kingdom in the cold weather. The eastern border of the Tang Empire, which had not seen a war for many years, was now in a state of blood and fire. Tens of thousands of grassland cavalrymen were wreaking havoc in the wilderness. 800 cavalrymen led tens of thousands of volunteers and the remnants of the northeast border military who returned from the Yin Kingdom. They carried out the fiercest resistance and gradually reversed the extremely passive situation. Fighting on their own land could receive strong support from the temporary government office and the Tang people. Apart from that, the most important reason why the Tang army could reverse the situation so quickly in the eastern border was that the grassland cavalrymen lacked a commander. Prince Longqing had gotten rid of this group of subordinates many days ago. Longqing did not leave the battlefield alone. He took with him nearly 1,000 of the most elite cavalrymen of Divine Hall, and more than 2,000 absolutely loyal cavalrymen of the Left King's Palace. The world war against the Tang Empire had been going on for some time. The clear autumn gradually passed, and the winter wind gradually rose. The fertile wilderness of the Tang Empire was frozen and hard. Every time the horses stepped on it, there would be smoke and dust. More than 3,000 cavalrymen galloped on the central wilderness of the Tang Empire. From afar, they looked like a yellow dragon. The cavalrymen were already extremely tired after the continuous high-speed attacks. Even Longqing felt that he could not hold on any longer. But he did not give the order to rest. The main force of the Tang Empire had been mobilized. Other than the ordinary prefectural armies, there was no defense force in the central counties. There was no way they could stop the cavalrymen. At this time, Longqing and his cavalrymen were close to Chang'an City. Of course, he could not rest. He knew that Chang'an City was about to open, and there was no defense in the city. The roads around Chang'an City were covered in dust and footprints. Abandoned luggage could also be seen. These were the traces left behind by the refugees in the surrounding areas. What was fortunate or admirable was that under the joint efforts of the Tang Empire, nearly 1 million refugees were brought into the city in just 2 days. There was not a single corpse on the road. The provisions transported from the various counties had already entered the city even earlier. The surrounding counties and villages had been completely abandoned, fortifying the walls and clearing the fields. All the city gates had already been closed, leaving only the southern gate facing Vermilion Bird Avenue open for people to enter and exit. There were few pedestrians outside the city gate, and a few soldiers were vigilantly watching all directions outside the city. Chang'an City was ready for battle, and they were full of confidence. The borders of the country had been broken, but the mountains and rivers were still there. Whether it was the imperial court of the Tang Empire, or the people in the city, they all thought that the enemy they were about to face should be the West Hill Divine Palace Army, going north from the Verdant Canyon. No one thought that on the official road in the east, Prince Longqing was leading the cavalry to break through, and no one knew who the real enemy of Chang'an City was. Therefore, they did not understand why the imperial court had never closed the southern gate, and why so many people and resources were mobilized to move the giant stones outside the southern gate at such a critical moment. Only the Academy and the Empress in the palace knew the real reason. The God-stunning array had been damaged. Chang'an City could now resist all kinds of armies, but could not resist the real enemy. The enemy that put Chang'an City in danger was not the cavalry of the Golden Palace, not Longqing and his cavalry, not the mighty Divine Hall army in the south. It was just one person, a very scary person. A young girl stood outside the southern gate, looking at the giant stones in the field, and feeling the familiar smell. Her ponytail swayed gently in the cold wind, and she somewhat missed the past. Ning Ke stood behind her, and his haggard expression finally relaxed a little. Although the blockage of the God-stunning array was still there, it would be much more difficult to enter the city with this stone array tactics. The girl was naturally the Academy's third sister, Yu Lian. She did not allow herself to immerse in such sentiments for too long, and calmly said, "After all, we still have to repair Chang'an City." Ning Ke said, "Still not enough?" Yu Lian said, "The headmaster has left the human world. In this world, there are only 4 people who can be called extraordinary. Two of them don't care about worldly affairs, and the chief preaching monk's law follows the thick soil. So the only one who can threaten Chang'an City is the Abbey Dean. This stone array tactics can at most stop him for a while, but how can it stop him for a lifetime?" Mo Shanshan slightly frowned, and seemed a little worried. Ning Ke had never seen the legendary Abbey Dean of Jishou Abbey. He thought that eldest brother had delayed this person for a few days, but he did not feel that the person was very powerful. Hearing this, he could not help but frown slightly. Yu Lian said, "Since the God-stunning array has been broken, if eldest brother did not use his life to stop us, all of us would have been killed by the Abbey Dean, and the war would have been over." Ning Ke said, "Eldest brother and senior sister, you have also broken the 5 states." Yu Lian said, "The 5 states are just a threshold. Breaking the 5 states does not mean that one is absolutely powerful. Although I have broken the 5 states, I may not be able to defeat Liu Bai. But the Abbey Dean is different." Ning Ke asked, "What's the difference?" Yu Lian said, "Do you know who is the youngest cultivator to break the 5 states in history?" Mo Shanshan thought for a while and asked, "My sworn brother?" Yu Lian said, "Eldest brother broke the distance in 3 days, but he was not young at that time. In terms of age, the founder of the Enlightenment doctrine and the great divine priest of light from 600 years ago were both older than him." Ning Ke thought of a possibility, but did not say anything. Yu Lian said, "The youngest cultivator to break the 5 states was surnamed Chun." Ning Ke looked at the wet stones in front of the south gate, and was shocked speechless. "So I am not surprised that Chun Pippi was the earliest to enter the knowing destiny state." Yu Lian said, Because his surname is also Chun, and he is the Abbey Dean's son. Ning Ke asked after a moment of silence. What kind of person is the Abbey Dean? Yu Lian said. The Abbey Dean was just an ordinary Taoist in a Taoist temple in the Kingdom of Song. He had no talent in cultivation, and had never even entered the West Hill Divine Palace. So he gave himself an ordinary name. The Kingdom of Song was a small country by the East Sea. It did not have any praiseworthy history, culture, or military. However, it had produced many famous people and great figures. 1,000 years ago, the great divine priest of light was from the Kingdom of Song. Wei Guangming was from the Kingdom of Song. Master Lotus was from the Kingdom of Song. Even the small town where second brother lived as a child should be in the Kingdom of Song. Ning Ke did not know until now that the Abbey Dean of the Jishou Abbey was also from the Kingdom of Song. It turned out that he had a strange name. Since I am so amazing, why? I am not famous and even give people a feeling of being ordinary. I am not an ordinary person, but I can give people a feeling of being ordinary. That is the scariest thing about me, Yu Lian said. As for the objective reasons, apart from the mysteriousness of the Jishou Abbey, I have been quiet these years mainly because the history of the past decades is a little different. Ning Ke asked, what is the difference between the history of the past and the history of the past? Yu Lian said, the biggest difference between the history of the past and the history books is that the Academy began to enter the human realm. In the back of the mountain of the Academy, only she did not call him youngest uncle. Instead, she called him Mr. Ku. That was because she was the suzerain of the Devil's Doctrine. After all, the Devil's Doctrine was destroyed by Kahaoren. Mo Shanshan said softly. After the trip to the wilderness, I asked the headmaster. He then knew that Master Lotus was still alive. He told me some stories about the past. He said that the Abbey Dean had once fought with Mr. Ku. That's right, Yu Lian said. There were no bystanders in the battle between Mr. Ku and the Abbey Dean. Except for the headmaster. No one in the world knows what happened at that time. They only know that Mr. Ku won in the end. After that, all the powerhouses of Haotian Taoism came out and ambushed Mr. Ku in the wilderness. Mr. Ku slashed them to his heart's content. He broke through several states, but refused to stop. So he pulled out his sword and flew towards the sky. He was then killed by Haotian. Because of this, the headmaster was extremely indignant. He went to the West Hill Divine Kingdom and slashed all the peach blossoms on the Peach Mountain. He killed countless powerhouses of Haotian Taoism. The Abbey Dean invited the chief preaching monk of the Xiankong Temple to help him, but they still failed. Yu Lian said, the Academy entered the human realm, so the Abbey Dean was nameless. Ning Ke understood what his senior sister said. As the youngest person to break through the 5 realms, Chen Mao undoubtedly had the right to leave his name in the history of cultivation. But because there were 2 other people's names in the history of these years, he did not have a shred of glory. One was the headmaster. The other was Kahaoren. But from another perspective, it also showed how powerful Chen Mao was. Because he lost to the youngest uncle and the headmaster. But he did not die. He was forced to wander on the South Sea, but he did not die. Maybe the headmaster cherished his talent. Or maybe the headmaster really could not kill him. Either way, it proved how powerful he was. The youngest uncle had passed away long ago, and the headmaster had also left the human realm. No one in the human realm was a match for the Abbey Dean. That person's glory that had been suppressed for many years was about to blossom. The enemy that Chang'an City was about to face was such a person. People knew that he was coming, but they did not know when he would come. Ning Ke felt that his shoulders had become a little heavy. He looked over the rugged boulders and fell on the forest beside the official road. Chang'an City had entered winter. The grass was not thick, and the wind and snow were coming. Don't laugh, everyone. A man's self-esteem is easy to make a joke at the wrong moment. I had a hard time writing today, and I hope it will be done soon. Now it seems that my cervical vertebra is affected. Oh, the reason for not updating is very positive. I hope that the Abbey Dean's battle can also be written with positive energy. I lay down more, and I hope to write faster. I'm really sorry, and I apologize again, because I did not manage myself well. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 776. Yu Lian continued. He had another adventure after coming to the South Sea. Although no one knows the details, the headmaster once sighed with emotion when he saw Pippi when he was still a child. Ning Ke was slightly stunned and said, "The great divine priest of light who disappeared in the South Sea 600 years ago." Yu Lian said, "Yes. I always think he has gained a lot from this." Ning Ke looked at the stones in front of the south gate and kept silent for a long time. He still felt a little unwilling and asked, "Senior brother and senior sister together, can't we defeat him?" The headmaster once said that life is a cultivation. Yu Lian said, "Sometimes cultivation depends on time. He's lived longer than my senior brother and I, so he's naturally stronger than us. Although my senior brother is talented, he's too gentle. Even if he learned how to fight, he'd still be no match for him." She did not comment on herself, which was also a tacit agreement. Ning Ke also thought of a very troublesome and crucial problem. Third sister was still injured, and it might be a very serious injury. The hierarch of the West Hill Divine Palace was a powerhouse beyond the 5 states. Although she was the most mysterious and powerful 23-year cicada cultivation, she had to pay a price to defeat that person. In the current situation, the only thing that could defeat the Abbey Dean of the Jisho Abbey was the God-stunning array. Ning Ke turned around and walked into the city gate, continuing his journey to solve the problem. As time went by, the chi of heaven and earth in Chang and became more and more stagnant because of the stone array tactics outside the south gate. Especially the dark line between life and death. It was very blocked. Ning Ke walked on the Vermilion Bird Avenue, walking in the blocked chi of heaven and earth. Countless refugees who evacuated into Chang and were arranged by the imperial court and the marketplace to live in various residences. There were few pedestrians on the long street, and most of the shops and restaurants along the street were closed. The street was no longer bustling with people. The cold winter wind blew back and forth in the street, making it particularly deserted. The Great Blockage Formation outside the South Gate played a very small role. Although it could block the Abbey Dean, it was confirmed that it was impossible to break through the blocked God-stunning array in a short time. Then where could he mobilize so much chi of heaven and earth to repair the God-stunning array? This problem had been bothering him for a long time. He had not slept or rested for several days and nights, racking his brains. Occasionally, he would feel something and even have a specific idea, but he could not find a way to implement it. How can those illusory auras turn into real power? Ning Ke looked at the vermilion bird painting in the middle of the street and asked. The vermilion bird did not reply, because it did not know either. Ning Ke turned around and continued walking. He thought of the steamed bun shop he had seen on the shore of Yinming Lake that morning, the hot mist on the bluestone, and the realization he had at that time. His mood became more and more depressed. He vaguely understood what he had to do, but he did not know how to do it. He saw hope in front of him, but he didn't know how to grasp it. He saw the other shore, but there was no boat, so his worries grew. He walked out of a quiet alley, and suddenly heard the sound of reading coming from behind the wall. Some private tutor was lecturing the students on the laws of the Tang Empire. Judging from their voices, the students were still very young. Their clear and childish voices recited the complicated laws of the Tang Empire. Their voices were uneven, but they were very focused. It was interesting and touching, seeing that the country was about to fall, and the family was about to perish. The sounds of reading could still be heard in the streets. He could still hear the laws of the Tang Empire. This calmness was very touching, and even awe-inspiring, because there was a kind of power in this calmness. Ning Ke stood outside the wall and quietly listened to the sound of reading. He listened for a long time. This was the aura of the human world. But how to make this power tangible? The Southern Gate Temple in front of the Imperial Palace was very quiet. Because of the tampering of the edict and He Ming-chi, the attitude of the imperial court of the Tang Empire towards the Southern Gate Temple had changed greatly. There were many people hiding outside the Taoist temple, and it was very chilling. Ning Ke walked up the stairs and entered the Southern Gate Temple. The Taoists in the Taoist temple saw him and could not help but be shocked. Then they came forward and bowed. He was the disciple of Master Yen Sei, and the Taoists in the Southern Gate Temple called him senior brother. Ning Ke waved his hand and motioned for the crowd to ignore him. He walked into the quiet Taoist temple alone and stood under the wall. He looked at the stories in the scriptures and the mythical legends and kept silent for a long time. Religion was best at turning the aura of the human world into real power. This was also the so-called power of faith. Although the power of faith of Haotian Taoism was used to pray to Haotian and connect the heaven and the earth to the divine man, which was completely opposite to what he wanted to do now. He wanted to see if he could get some kind of inspiration. Ning Ke walked around Chang'an, just like that summer when he first understood talisman. So he came to Wanyan Tower again and climbed up the Wanyan Tower. Standing by the small window at the top of the tower and looking at the quiet Chang'an city, he asked, "Can people's thoughts really be transformed into concrete power? If so, how do we go through it?" Thoughts themselves have no power, but once they are displayed, they may show some kind of power. Just like His Majesty's Imperial Edict, if it is only a thought in the mind, it will have no effect. Only when he says it out or writes it on paper will his thoughts have any effect. Master Huang Yang walked to his side and looked at the last flock of autumn geese gradually flying south. He said, "If the way you asked about is equivalent to a method, then language is a method, and writing is also a method." Ning Ke asked, "What about faith?" Master Huang Yang said, "Faith itself has no power. It needs a specific direction. When countless people's faith is concentrated in that direction, the power will be reflected in that direction. Buddha strictly forbids his disciples from setting up idols because of this." Master Huang Yang looked at him and continued, "Your master Yen Sei once said that everyone's thoughts are actually a talisman, but they are too weak to be felt. When everyone writes a talisman at the same time, this talisman may appear, or even become great." Ning Ke understood something. It was really possible to find a way to summon the power of the human world that could compete with heaven and earth. If he could find that power, he could unblock the God-stunning array. He came to the south bank of Yanming Lake and sat among the frosty grass. He stretched his fingers into the air and copied a few inscriptions. When he calmed down, he began to write and began to look for that word. Having entered the knowing destiny state, any word he wrote was a talisman. Writing was writing talisman. The word he was looking for was actually a talisman. The sun gradually moved west and then fell below the city wall. Night came. He sat by the lake and continued to write talisman. He searched for the word and the talisman. Hundreds of words. Thousands of words. Finally, there was only one word left. That word was formed by two straight lines. It was the only divine talisman he knew. The two horizontal talisman. He kept writing the two horizontal talisman until he was exhausted. His eyes brightened and dimmed, then brightened and dimmed again, and finally became numb. After an unknown amount of time, he stopped writing. He looked at the courtyard across the Yanming Lake in a daze. At this moment, a snowflake drifted down and landed on his body. He thought of the snow that year. He thought of the battle on the snow lake. Sang Sang held the big black umbrella and stood in the wind and snow, singing to the snow lake. If Sang Sang was still there, if the big black umbrella and iron arrows were still there, he was really confident that even if he could not unblock Chang'an City, he could use the God-stunning array to kill that man. However, Sang Sang was already dead. The courtyard across the lake had no lights for many days. The people sent by the imperial court to the Sishui River reported that the big black horse and carriage had disappeared. He had to find the word that could mobilize the power of the human world. The snowflakes continued to fall. A few eyelashes fluttered down. His face was pale, but his cheeks were flushed, which looked extremely unhealthy. He looked calm, but in fact he was extremely anxious and tired. He could not find the word, and he could not write the talisman. Master Yensei spent his whole life to find the talisman, let alone him. Ninkei sighed. A white mist. He raised his finger, continued to write, and continued to search. He wrote in the white mist, in the falling snow, and on the ground that was gradually covered with snow. Because of fatigue and nervousness, his hand trembled more and more severely. The two strokes of the two horizontal talisman sometimes became a little crooked. It snowed in Chang'an City. This was the first snow in the 18th year of Tianqi. The first snow. The night gradually faded, and the morning came. The streets and eaves of the city were covered with white snow, and it was very clean. Last night, the wind came from the north, and the south of the city was quiet. Because there was no cold wind, the southern city wall was covered with a light layer of snow. It looked like a white curtain. Suddenly, there was a footprint in the thin snow on the city wall. It was about 100 feet from the ground. The goshawk could build its nest, but people could not. But there was one more footprint. After a moment, another footprint appeared in the thin snow on the city wall hundreds of feet away. Then, a pair of footprints appeared behind it. The two footprints belonged to two people. The winter eagle was awakened by the footsteps on the city wall. It looked into the distant sky warily. The footprints of the two people were clearly on the city wall. But it looked into the sky. On the endless city wall of Chang'an, the footprints of the two people appeared from time to time. No one could be seen. Only footprints could be seen. It was like the traces left by immortals in the human world. The footprints gradually reached the south gate. In the light snowflakes, a touch of indigo appeared. The Abbey Dean of the Jisho Abbey appeared outside the south gate. A Taoist sword was carried on his back. He had not slept for 7 days, and he had traveled tens of thousands of miles between mountains and rivers. But he was still refreshed. Suddenly, a wooden stick appeared in the snow. The wooden stick was very short, very hard. The wooden stick hit the back of the Abbey Dean's head. The Abbey Dean waved his sword. The sword and the wooden stick met. There was a loud sound. The sound was melodious and loud. The sound was loud. Chang'an City woke up. The bell in the city rang loudly. Maybe it was because of the sound of the bell, or because of the collision between the sword and the wooden stick, or because of that person. The thin snow on the southern city wall, which was more than 10 miles long, rustled down. It revealed the black color of the city wall. There was a lot of snow under the city wall. Like a falling curtain, it piled up in one place. I like the last scene very much. It would be beautiful if it was made into a movie. Roll call. This chapter is almost over. I hope it can return to normal as soon as possible. Now you can scold me all you want. I also want to scold the days when it takes 6 hours to write a chapter. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 777. The snow fell like a curtain, and fell at the foot of the city wall, forming a snow line about half a man's height in front of the south gate. A scholar came and stood in front of the snow line silently. He was still wearing the old cotton-padded jacket, but now it was full of cuts made by swords. Hundreds of cotton flowers squeezed out of it, and shivered in the snow wind. Some of the blood that he had shed over the past few days had been blown away by the wind between the mountains and rivers, but most of it had coagulated on the cotton that had bloomed, making it look extremely black and ugly. In addition, the wooden stick in his hand had many shallow sword marks on it, making him look like a beggar who had been chased by a vicious dog for many days. Although his appearance was a little disheveled, his expression was still calm, giving off a feeling of cleanliness from the inside out. Just like the slowly falling first snow, he looked at the Abbey Dean and said, "Chang'an is the last place the Academy chose. The Abbey Dean looked at him and said, I chose this place first. Eldest brother asked, Why? The Abbey Dean said, Because this city can no longer stop me. Eldest brother asked, Then why did you come so late? Because this city can't stop me until now. The Abbey Dean held the Taoist sword in his hand and looked at the magnificent city in front of him. He said, The academy is waiting and so am I. You are waiting for this city to recover, and I am waiting for it to weaken. Eldest brother said, It seems that you have waited for the result you wanted. The Abbey Dean said, Don't be surprised about this result. I have prepared for many years to break this array. Since the headmaster left the human world, no one can change the course. No matter if we follow or not, we can't go against the will of heaven. He looked at eldest brother in front of the snow line and said, This snow line can't stop me, and neither can the academy. I will kill you and destroy the God-stunning array. Then everything will be over. After saying this, he walked towards Chang'an. The road outside the south gate was covered with a shallow layer of snow. The Abbey Dean's right foot had just touched the ground, and he did not even leave a mark on the snow. He only took one step, or more precisely half a step. The Abbey Dean looked down at the ground. He was wearing cloth shoes. There was a small stone beside the cloth shoes. He looked at the stone and frowned slightly. Then he withdrew his right foot and returned to his original position. The Abbey Dean looked around and noticed that thousands of stones had appeared around the south gate of Chang'an City. The stones were of different sizes, sharp edges and round like eggs. However, no matter what shape the stone was, all of them gave off an extremely strong sense of stubbornness and injustice. The aura seemed so silent and unwilling, and it seemed as if it wanted to fill the entire world. That aura was so distinct, so silent, and so firm that the aura of heaven and earth in the south of Chang'an City was forcibly stuffed with countless obstacles, making it difficult to breathe. Because of the existence of these stones, the naturally existing dark passageways between heaven and earth became as difficult as breathing. In other words, there was no limitless in this world of stones. The first snow fell overnight. The thousands of stones in the south of Chang'an looked like soldiers in white armor, while the big stones were like the snowfield wolves in the north, full of killing intent. The Abbey Dean looked at the stones and suddenly laughed. He had been to the Daming Lake in the wilderness more than once, so he naturally knew about the stone array tactics. Using the stone array tactics to break the limitless state, the academy was really interesting. But why would he be afraid? He didn't step forward. He stood quietly among the stones, waiting for the academy's next move. Eldest brother took a step forward and disappeared in the light snow. The Abbey Dean knew that he didn't enter the limitless state, but the stone array tactics blocked the light and sight. In the rugged stone array, they couldn't see each other, so he did nothing but wait quietly for the academy to attack him. The snow was still falling slowly, and it was faint and beautiful, but when it was about to fall on the ground, it suddenly disappeared, and then fell dozens of feet away, or even hundreds of feet away. It felt very strange. A thin piece of snow fell along the black city wall, and fell on the Abbey Dean outside the city. Along with the snow, a short wooden stick also fell. The wooden stick broke the wind silently, and even the blocked aura between heaven and earth were not affected at all. It followed the natural flow of the wind and snow, and arrived without a trace. The Abbey Dean's eyes slightly brightened. The wooden stick seemed simple and ordinary, but in his eyes, it was more amazing than the Great Blockage Formation. He just learned to fight a few days ago, and now he could display such a state. When it came to learning speed, who in the world could be compared with him? The Abbey Dean raised his sword to face the wind and snow in front of him, thinking that if the headmaster of the academy had ascended to heaven 10 years later, with such a terrifying learning speed, he might not be able to suppress him like now. The Taoist sword broke the wind and snow, and then it hit the wooden stick in the seemingly empty falling snow. This was the second time that the sword and the stick met since they came to Chang'an. Different from the shocking scene of falling snow in the city when they first met, this time the sword and the stick met. It seemed so quiet and gentle, like the first snow falling into the lake, about to melt. Thousands of stones in front of the south gate emitted a rugged and stiff aura. When the sword and the stick met, a very gentle aura instantly diluted the aura of the stone array tactics. The sword and the stick met in the air, at a point, and remained still. In the space of dozens of feet around that point, everything was still, whether it was the wind or the snow. The snowflakes stopped falling and stayed still in the air. The scene was extremely strange. Then the snowflakes broke, starting from the edge, until the center of the snowflakes was broken into the finest powder. The powder like snow fell down, and sprinkled on the Abby Dean and eldest brother. The eldest brother's cotton-padded jacket was torn again, and blood flowed out again. The wind and snow rose from the ground and blew around him, like a pair of invisible wings, pushing his wounded body back like flowing snow, out of the stone array tactics and into Chang'an. The Abby Dean frowned slightly, and was a little surprised. There was the stone array tactics in the south of the city. There was no distance in the eyes, but there was distance. This had a great impact on him, and an even greater impact on the other party. But since the academy had found a way to break the limitless, there must be a follow-up method. So he let the powder snow fall on him, and was ready for the academy's next move. However, the academy did nothing, and directly retreated into Chang'an. In this case, he had to enter Chang'an. To enter Chang'an, he had to break through the rugged rocks in front of him. The Abby Dean waved his sleeves, rolling up layers of snow like flowing clouds. Beside the state highway, a huge rock weighing tens of thousands of kilograms was lifted up by the wind of his sleeves, and fell far away in the field. He waved his sleeves again, and another huge rock flew up. He walked toward the city gate. Along the way, he rolled up his sleeves like clouds, and destroyed rocks and formations along the way. How to cast stone array tactics. When Koharan entered the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine, he broke it with his sword. But he rolled it up with his sleeves. This did not mean that the current Abby Dean was stronger than Koharan. Most importantly, the Great Blockage Formation in the south of the city was far less powerful than the one at the bottom of the Daming Lake. As the leader of Taoism, he had a deep understanding of the Devil's Doctrine. He knew that the real stone array tactics must be a world made up of stubborn rocks. Although there were thousands of stubborn rocks in the south of the city, it was not a world. If it was not a complete world, there would be space. If there was space, there would be walking, and there would be more space. Outside the city, there was the sound of falling rocks. The wind and snow gradually stopped, and the indigo robe was approaching. On the city wall, Mo Shanshan's hair was covered with snowflakes, and her lips were bleeding. Her face was slightly pale. The Abby Dean waved his sleeves casually, and the stone array tactics was broken. Walking through the south gate, he entered Chang'an. There was no pedestrian on the Vermilion Bird Avenue. It was extremely quiet, and only the snow kept falling. The Abby Dean walked on the straight Vermilion Bird Avenue, looking relaxed. He looked at the buildings beside the avenue, the carvings in the middle of the street that were not completely covered by the snow, the black eaves, and the old tiles covered with snow. He looked like an ordinary tourist. So Chang'an is like this. Many years ago, when he was still a child, he once came to Chang'an with the elders of his family. But it was too long ago, and he had no specific memory of this city. Later, he began to cultivate Taoism, and never came to Chang'an again, because he became very powerful as soon as he began to cultivate Taoism. Without an invitation, Chang'an would not allow him to enter. More importantly, the headmaster of academy had always been in the academy in the south of Chang'an. What was unobtainable was the best. Whether it was cultivation, men and women, or anything else, it was the same. So he liked Chang'an very much. Unfortunately, this city did not belong to him, so he had to destroy it. He had been thinking about this city for many years. He had been thinking about destroying this city for many years. Today he finally entered this city. He could not help but sigh. He looked up at the falling snow and said, "If you see this scene from the sky, will you regret leaving this world too early?" At this moment, cicadas suddenly chirped on the Vermilion Bird Avenue. The snowflakes falling from the sky seemed to have a layer of brightness and became thin cicada wings. It was winter, and the first snow had arrived. Where did the cicadas come from? The Abbey Dean slightly tilted his head and listened carefully. Finally, a serious look appeared in his eyes. After confirming that the stone array tactics could not stop him, he decisively gave up and let the academy retreat into Chang, and using the power of the city itself. The person who could make such a decision was certainly not an ordinary person. He knew that there must be some interesting people waiting for him in Chang'an, but he did not expect that it would be so interesting. It turned out that this was the last confidence of the academy. There are cicadas in the west. They hide in the mud for 23 years, and only wake up when the snow melts and floods come. They take a bath in the mud, dry their wings in the cold wind, and fly out of the void. The Abbey Dean looked at the wind and snow on the other side of the street and said calmly, "So you are here." The snow clouds thickened and covered the sky. The shrill chirping of cicadas resounded through Chang'an. A little girl walked out of the wind and snow. "I'm really not in good health. I need to ask for leave for the new year in February." So please vote for the more diligent writers. I will try to do it well after the meeting in early March. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.